All right. Good morning, afternoon, and evening, y'all. I'm pleased to announce that Martin Sieff is going to be today's speaker. As you all know, I think everybody here has watched probably many more than simply one or two of Marty's brilliant presentations to the Rise and Tide Foundation. He's also got a little podcast, which is a lot of fun, very educational with Pele Neroth Taylor. That's also available. I'll put in the description box for those who are not following that. We desperately need sanity, especially in the political class, which has been without such a virtue for far too long. And the effects of a world spiraling out of control are demonstrations of what happens when you detach wisdom and courage from politics. And here we get a big giant mess. So there are a number of case studies peppered throughout history, not too many, but really special, glorious case studies, which we could extract great lessons from, not the least of which includes the figure of Charles de Gaulle as just an amazing singularity within universal history who really touched or locked into something very pure and substantial within his culture that is I haven't seen a lot of that since his death. And I think it was 1972 or 73 in the French culture or anything in the West. And so Marty, who's done an immense amount of work in thinking about this topic of Charles de Gaulle and his battles with various aspects of the deep state, from NATO to everything you could imagine of a fascist flavor, has agreed to really share a lot of that so that we could learn lessons that we could apply to problem solving in our current situation, which is at the heart of all research into history. Is how do we apply it to our current moment in history, these lessons, in order to change our future. So Marty, thank you so much for doing this. The stage is all yours.
Thank you very much, Matt. Now, this is an extraordinary man who towered over my life long before I realized it. I was raised and lived and unquestioningly accepted the conventional Anglo-American liberal wisdom of the West when I grew up, and really held it unquestioningly into my 30s, when largely through traveling around the world, and especially spending time in France with some extraordinary and eminent Gaullists who are still around in the 1980s, I started to have ask myself questions. And I think very often we're forced to become our own Socrates. We don't mean to, we start out accepting what we've been force fed, but the best teachers we have and the best experiences we have in life don't challenge us. They provoke us to challenge ourselves and to look around and say, hey, it's not the way I always thought it was. But that means ... De Gaulle was outside the Anglo-American conventional wisdom I grew up with, totally. He's seen as an admirable, heroic figure, but also as an absurd and pain in the neck one, as even contemptible. Franklin Roosevelt loathed him and regarded him as almost the equivalent of Hitler and certainly more dangerous than Mussolini. Franklin Roosevelt, who I continue to revere, and I believe we all do in this audience, so much. And yet when it came to de Gaulle, his extraordinary vision failed in that direction. Churchill, a loathsome and contemptible figure in so many ways, recognized the stature of de Gaulle. David Ben-Gurion in Israel, at a time when de Gaulle outraged a Jewish generation who were still reeling alive from the Holocaust and made remarks which were widely seen as anti-Semitic and were certainly, in many respects, outrageous and contemptuous to Jewish people, provoked a huge anti-Gaullist reaction across the Jewish world. And David Ben-Gurion rejected that. What did Ben-Gurion say? The founding father of the state of Israel? But you must remember, he is a great man. And as we shall see, the very issues emerging in Israel that de Gaulle saw 50 years ahead of his time, that now threaten to destroy the world, Ben-Gurion himself saw too, and he was on the same page as de Gaulle, even on that. We also look at the moral regeneration of Europe after World War II. And de Gaulle is one of the two central figures in that. The other one, a figure of great distrust to many because of his apparent subservience to the Anglo-American alliance. And certainly he turned a blind eye to many of the most outrageous Nazis who reemerged in the Federal Republic of Germany in the 50s and 60s. But de Gaulle thought the world of him, and he thought the world of de Gaulle, Konrad Adenauer. And the relationship between Konrad Adenauer and Charles de Gaulle, we shall also see, is essential for the future survival of humanity in more ways than one. Most of all, the example they set of French-German partnership and understanding after 3 monstrous wars in the previous 70 years. And we must not forget, after 400 years of French repeated invasions and rape and despoliation of Germany, that went, 350 years, that went back to the 30 Years' War. And it is de Gaulle and Adenauer in partnership who so successfully buried those demons without repressing them by creating a new future for the role for the German and French peoples together, that today the idea of Franco-German hostility and war is effectively inconceivable to successive generations of people in France and Germany. This, I maintain, is a literal spiritual miracle. It flows directly from President de Gaulle, and so do many others. Now, in a way, this is going to be a back-to-front lecture. I am going to start, as I have begun here, with de Gaulle's lessons for the 21st century, which are quite extraordinary and are still extremely unfashionable, though I think for reasons which will quickly become obvious, they will be very fashionable to this particular audience. For 3 specific reasons. The first is de Gaulle is a champion of the nation state. He does not believe in the European Union as it has developed. He does not believe in the George Soros view of one world, nor does he believe in a secular, demented liberalism devoid of traditional Christian and classical traditions. De Gaulle was a conservative Catholic. He also embraced the Renaissance. And we usually forget, no one in France forgets, but why was Francois I, at the beginning of the 16th century, arguably the greatest of all French kings, much greater than Louis XIV, arguably the greatest of all, apart from arguably Charlemagne himself? There are many reasons, but a key reason is he imports the Renaissance to France. He brings Leonardo da Vinci to France, and the whole beating heart of the Renaissance, everything that is achieved by Descartes in the 17th century, and that French scientists and philosophers continue to achieve through into the 18th century, the role of France in expediting the freedom of America at the end of the 18th century, ultimately flows from the classical values of the Florentine Renaissance that are only brought to France, but they are brought to France in the most spectacular and most massive ways by Francois Premier, by Francis I, when he brings Leonardo da Vinci as his personal advisor to France at the beginning of the 16th century. And Francois Premier thinks so much of da Vinci that he even visits and supports the dying da Vinci on his deathbed in the chateau or castle he has given as a personal gift to da Vinci when da Vinci is dying. Charles de Gaulle is in, as we shall see, that tradition too. He rises, he transcends, he is extraordinary. Here is a man from the best of provincial France, but it is like in America coming from Ohio, or perhaps from Quebec, rural Quebec, not Quebec City, but rural Quebec, and not even from anywhere on Ontario. That's too advanced. Find me the most socially conservative province in Canada, a Saskatchewan and Alberta without oil, right? And Alberta, with growth prospects, decent, honourable, upright, but with the narrowest intellectual imagination and limits. And that is where Charles de Gaulle comes from. He is the son of a conservative teacher, an upright man, a serious scholar, the kind of person I knew and still know as old friends back in Northern Ireland. We all know them. People who are bright and upright and moral and decent and even brilliant and usually very wise, but they stay at home. They do not leave their small towns or their small cities. Now, there are many negative things to be said about Harry S. Truman. I have said many of them. Matt certainly has too. Most of us here would agree with him. But what of his admirers said about him? There is a saying that in every American town of 20 to 50,000 people, there is at least one person capable of being president of the United States. And Harry Truman proved that proposition true. Actually, you could also say Harry Truman proves how necessary a college education is, because he didn't have one. And look at the world he bequeathed to us. You can flip Truman and argue both ways with him. And I tend, as Jenny does, clearly to the skeptical side of Truman. But nevertheless, he was president for 8 years. And he took the world in directions I do not like, and none of us should like. But he was there, and he held things together. And nobody thought he would last more than, if you compare him, for example, with the catastrophes of Herbert Hoover and Woodrow Wilson, who were revered as God figures in their day. Truman, as somebody utterly unprepared for the presidency, acquits himself at least reasonably in that company. I agree with you, the bar is set very low. But we look at de Gaulle's father. De Gaulle's father was like that. And de Gaulle, significantly enough, was very close to his father all his life. He rose, even while his father was alive, to unimaginable heights, but they stayed close. And when he wrote his early brilliant books on military theory and military warfare, his father was close too. Now, the great demigod of the West, who is now bringing us into thermonuclear destruction today, is obviously not Franklin Roosevelt. It's not even Harry S. Truman. And the world would be saved if we followed the examples of John Kennedy, but of course we do not. Who is the great God King guide to Netanyahu in Israel, to the idiots in London, at the City of London, and to President Trump, God help us, in the route he is now taking in Washington? It is, of course, Winston Churchill. And in the Anglo-Saxon world, the idea that de Gaulle should be seen as a figure even remotely comparable to Churchill is regarded as a blasphemy, as a joke. De Gaulle is not taken seriously, but as we shall see here, as a human being, as a philosopher, as an example of how to live life, and as a champion of policies that are realistic and successful beyond all imaginations. It is de Gaulle who is the great man rather than Churchill. One lecture I might suggest giving, I float this out as an idea now, Matt, and to others, in the future, is the opposite of today's lecture. It is how Winston Churchill destroyed the British Empire over a 45-year period while thinking he was building it up to even more manic heights. He destroyed the entire structure of the British Empire. He had actually destroyed it by 1922-23, when Canada, South Africa, and Australia, also New Zealand, were all about to leave the British Empire, and India was in revolt because of Churchill's policies to try and start yet another Middle East war, this time with Turkey. And Churchill had already exposed the peoples of Australia and New Zealand to the ghastly bloodbaths in Gallipoli. And thousands of Indian troops had died because of his policies, conquering Iraq for its oil. And even the British overlords of India refused to go along with Churchill. But when Stanley Baldwin comes in, he does not destroy the British Empire. He saves the British Empire from total dissolution after David Lloyd George and Winston Churchill have brought it to the brink of total disintegration with the secession of Canada, Australia and New Zealand and South Africa and even Imperial India openly being discussed by their rulers at the time until Baldwin pulls the British out of the Middle East and signals to the rest of the empire, no more Churchill adventures, no more mad Lloyd George visions, no more war. Now, in all of Churchill's life, Churchill comes in when the British Empire rules a quarter of the world, the most powerful empire the world has ever known, an enormous system of repression. By the time he leaves office as Prime Minister in 1955, it's nearly all gone. India has gone, the Middle East has gone. By the time he dies 10 years later, and he has enough wit to see it and it appalls him, Africa is gone too. Of course, the City of London keeps a very dark financial and direct hold over the empire, which de Gaulle, as we shall see later, rightly fights. But what we see with Churchill is far from saving the British Empire, he dissolves it. De Gaulle does the opposite in France. In 1940, he takes over the leadership of a France which is spiritually and physically exhausted, which has been reduced to its lowest level in the entirety of its 1100-year recorded history. To the time of Charlemagne, he has nothing. He restores the integrity and self-respect and soul and spirit of the French people within 2 years. Within 4 years, a major French army, larger even than the Canadian and Polish forces, and almost as militarily significant as the British forces fighting alongside the United States in the Western Theatre of Operations, is operating with enormous success. It drives up from Marseille all the way up France with the US 7th Army. And with the U.S. Army Group under the hugely underestimated General Jacob Devers, another French army operating under General Patton, under the amazing General Philippe Leclerc, liberates Paris directly in the fall of 1944. When the Germans counterattack because of Eisenhower's utterly bungled broad front policies at the end of 1944 against the Allies, and the war is extended for another 6 months, the additional forces of the Free French, hundreds of thousands of strong now in a regular organized U.S. Militarily equipped force, but a very formidable force in their own right, turns out to be of crucial support to the British and the Americans, which they are never given credit for in the last year of the war. All this is de Gaulle's doing. The Fourth Republic is established after the war. The pre-war politicians go back to the same feuding, petty maneuvering in Parliament under a weakened political system, all too similar to the way Congress has descended in the United States today, and perhaps your own Canadian Parliament has gone to now. De Gaulle again comes to the rescue. In 1958, he regenerates democracy in France and is an example for all of Europe. Everyone agrees the Fourth Republic is dying of civil war in 1958. It has fought 2 colonial wars it should never have started fighting in the first place. Instead of giving the Vietnamese people their freedom and the Algerian people their freedom, millions die in Algeria, millions more die in Southeast Asia, because the so-called liberal Democrats in France are frightened to look weak, just like the Democrats in America, and millions of innocent people halfway around the world pay for their fake macho Joe Biden type policies with their own blood. Who ends this? De Gaulle ends this. And de Gaulle brings peace by bringing an army over from Algeria. De Gaulle is supported by the hardline fascist nationalist right in France when he takes power in 1958, because they see him correctly as a strong and decisive man, as a great military leader, as an extraordinarily successful general. Now, in the English-speaking world, nobody realizes what an important general and what a brilliantly successful general de Gaulle was. We'll go into that in a few minutes. There are lessons for that in the 21st century. Because in the world, unfortunately, it looks like we are going into, eventually there will be the world we visualize here and we discuss. But as we all know all too well, the forces of darkness are hostile to the forces of peace. And we are being pulled right now towards not one, but several global confrontations catastrophically at the same time. If that happens, future de Gaulle figures will have to look to not to the empty rhetoric of Churchill, but to the hard, solid achievements of the true British hero of World War II, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, and most of all, to the greater achievements yet of de Gaulle, which are spiritual and political and strategic, as well as directly military, as we shall see in the next few minutes. Now, again, I'm mingling my approaches here. I originally wanted to start with why de Gaulle is relevant for the 21st century. As you see, in my own confused way, I am trying to do that. But I was also strongly tempted to go through the life of de Gaulle first, because how can you talk about his achievements without knowing what the achievements were and the unlikelihood of where he comes from with them? In the case of Churchill, again, it's the opposite. Churchill is supposed to be a genius. He is the grandson of a duke. He has privilege all his life. He is already one of the most powerful human beings on the planet. And before World War I, when he is hardly 30, he basically runs almost a quarter of the world, all the British colonies in the world. That doesn't include the White Dominions, and India is run separately. But all of Africa and large chunks of Asia are directly ruled by Winston Churchill when he's only 32, 33 years old, as Undersecretary for the Colonies in the Liberal government of Henry Asquith. That's extraordinary. And by the time he is 37, he controls what the equivalent of the Strategic Air Command under General Curtis LeMay. He controls Britain's Royal Navy, which is the most powerful and far-flung force of deploying military force and coercion in the world, and arguably through history to that point. And his rule of that, again, a future lecture to be included in a future, Churchill's role is catastrophically stupid and incompetent. By contrast, let us look at de Gaulle. He does not have any of Churchill's advantages of networking, of being part of the ruling class, of being the grandson of the Duke of Marlborough, of being part of the great elite. He is the son of a provincial schoolmaster. He joins the French army. He is obsessed with military history. He is a military intellectual. And he is also a romantic dreamer, but of an interesting kind. He wants to be the savior of France. He writes about it when he is 19 years old. He has a vision of himself as the constable of France, not a king, not a tyrant, certainly not a genocidal conqueror or liquidator, but as the man who rescues his country and is the embodiment of the soul of it. Extraordinary vision for a little boy to have. And he's somewhat of a loner and a ridiculous little boy. He's very self-confident, but he's incredibly tall. He's ugly. He has this ridiculous nose that sticks out like a beanpole, which should not be underestimated because it made him more of a loner. And by nature, he is also sensitive and shy, which he hides behind the mask of aloofness, which, being an officer in the French army, gives him both the opportunity and also the acceptance of. He is accepted as a loner because many, elite officers in the English elite tradition is to be one of the lads, an officer along with many others. The Nazi leader Goering, who was a gangster and a bastard, but also brilliant and a genius in his own way, told great jokes. And one of the most revealing ones is not about the French, but it comes to reveal de Gaulle too. Goering describes in one of his favorite jokes, which was recorded in his talk at Nuremberg after he's arrested, end of World War II, the difference between the English and the Germans. You have one German. What do you have? I hasten to add, Uwe, we both know, thankfully, this is most certainly not Germany today, but this at least was the perception of Germany. And it wasn't even true before World War I, but it came to be true under the monstrosity of Weimar that Woodrow Wilson and Churchill and Lloyd George created at Versailles in 1919. What Goering says, what do you have when you have a German? One German, a fine fellow, good friend, great company, likes a beer, laughs at a good obscene joke, loves his wife, loves his children, is a softie to his children, and honest, hardworking to a T. That's your individual German. But two Germans, an extremist political party, three Germans, a war. Then Goering contrasts this with the English. One Englishman, not a patch on an individual German. One Englishman, an idiot. Utterly ignorant of everything, always getting drunk, lazy, hapless, useless at his job, a trade unionist, drives everybody crazy. But two Englishmen, a club, and they scratch each other's backs. They can be Freemasons, they can be Elks, they can be harmless, they can be Knights Templar, anything. But two Englishmen, and they're scratching each other's backs and getting each other on in the world. You've got a club. Three Englishmen, an empire. And nobody, France, Germany, Italy, Russia, none of even America, nobody can stand against that. That's what Goering says. But in the case of France, one French little boy, immensely sweet, one French adult, an upright snob, drives you crazy, insists on just the right wine and cheese. Otherwise, he will never speak to you again. Right? But two Frenchmen wearing uniforms, incredibly brave, gallant, revered military officers. But they belong to the age of Napoleon and Louis XIV. In modern war, they all get shot down and killed. Three Frenchmen, there aren't enough to be free Frenchmen anymore. They've all been killed in World War I. And then De Gaulle comes along. De Gaulle goes to World War I. Like Field Marshal Montgomery in the British Army, he's lucky to survive it. They are both brave. They are both at the time unquestioning patriots. They do not question even the tactics of the war until they look back afterwards and see how all their friends have died uselessly and for nothing. De Gaulle is seriously injured but survives the war. He is a prisoner of war for a couple of years in Germany. Gets to know the Germans very well. This turns out to be of priceless importance 50 years later, because it's like Nelson Mandela being a prisoner of the Boer apartheid state, doing hard labor under them for a quarter of a century. He gets to know his oppressors. In the Bible, it's like Moses growing up at the court of Pharaoh, thinking he's an Egyptian. Mohandas K. Gandhi, a man who, like Matt, I personally loathe, but he was a brilliant little evil shit. And he was brilliant. And where did he learn how to handle the British? Why, in London, of course. He studied law and was a brilliant law graduate, as you clearly know, I'm sure better than me, Jenny, in the Temple, in the law court, interesting name that, in the law courts of London. Before he even meets Madame Blavatsky and becomes her ardent disciple. Gandhi understands the English at the highest level from the inside. He can get inside their minds, just as General Vaux-Nguyen Giap studies the works of Napoleon and Jomini and the great French military theorists and commanders to be able to defeat them using the principles of Sun Tzu, who was not Vietnamese either, and he later uses the principles of Sun Tzu successfully against the Chinese themselves. Giap is someone else we should study here, one of the most ruthless and terrifying generals of the 20th century, easily the most successful and the most versatile, and also a champion, incredibly, of great humanitarian values in his and suffering in his life, and forgiveness in his life as well. Giap is endlessly fascinating. De Gaulle's on the other side, but he has a similar strange, extraordinary, inspiring spiritual development. He always remains a devout Catholic, a devout Christian conservative, but there is more to him almost from the beginning from that. First, from his own father, and his father described himself as a French monarchist in my heart, but a Republican loyalist in my mind. In other words, he believed in a traditional, hierarchical, structured, restrained society. But he was not a radical revolutionary, and he was ready to accommodate himself to a wider world than he himself came from. And his son does this in the most spectacular way. After World War I, De Gaulle comes back to France, and at first his rise is rapid and then it stops. He is an intellectual. He reads a great deal. He comes to the attention of the most brilliant figure the French army has produced in terms of winning battles, the most important French general, successful French general, arguably in history, General Philippe Pétain, the man who truly won World War I. And he has an intimately close relationship with Pétain, who takes him on board as his disciple. And this, again, has repercussions 30 years later when de Gaulle personally protects Pétain. After Pétain has been Nazi Germany's puppet in World War II, everybody wants to hang Pétain and shoot him. He's already 90 years old. He doesn't know what's going on around him, but he was the image of shameful France, the France that turned over its Jewish people to the Nazis, the France that gave the Nazis everything they wanted, the defeatist France of 1940. De Gaulle has every reason to go along with this by this point, but no. He has the soul of generosity in the greatest Christian and Renaissance classical traditions. And he pardons Pétain. Pétain lives out the rest of his years in life imprisonment. He lives well into his 90s. Obviously, the Spur Diet in his remote island jail agreed with him. But de Gaulle protected him when every other politician in France was determined to hang him, because de Gaulle remembered how Pétain had saved hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of French lives during World War I. And how France would have been annihilated in World War I had it not been for Pétain. And what does de Gaulle say? De Gaulle says he doesn't excuse the catastrophic decisions Pétain made in 1940. He says he was already more than 80 years old. His mind had long gone. Old age is a shipwreck. And this is quintessential de Gaulle. Churchill writes endless volumes of empty shit. And people revere it, but they never read it. Have any of you ever read one volume of Churchill's history of the Second World War? Don't. But if you really want to be cruel to yourselves, or you know somebody you want to be cruel to, get them to read it and see what they can think. The first volume is the best because at least it has the speeches he gave in the 1930s when he was at his best. And the speeches are great philippics. They're enormously entertaining. If Churchill's name somehow survives, which I don't think it will actually, I don't. But if it does, it will be on the strength of those speeches, like Cicero's speeches or Demosthenes' speech. And let us remember, Demosthenes and Cicero were both political failures, total failures in politics. As Churchill was, the speeches turned out to be a waste of time. But de Gaulle writes books which are classic, but he comes out, as we shall see again and again, with individual phrases that burn into your soul and that you never want to lose. He has 3 children. He has a son, Philippe, he is close to all his life, who becomes a leading admiral in the French Navy and becomes a major pioneering figure in developing France's own independent nuclear deterrent, and an extraordinarily successful right-hand man to his father. Contrast this with Winston Churchill's one legitimate son, Randolph, who turns out to be a drunken, abusive, though highly entertaining, ruin and monster of a man. Even as a father, de Gaulle is head and shoulders above. Churchill despises mentally retarded people who we now say is having Down syndrome. He despises them. He calls them idiot morons. He privately even discusses euthanasia for them. De Gaulle has such a child. His second daughter, his younger daughter, Anne, never had mental capability beyond that of a 3 to 5 year old child. And yet, far from being ashamed of her, de Gaulle, even as leader of the Free French, even as president of France for the first time from 1944 to 46, with all the world in chaos around him, always finds time to play and have time with his mentally deficient daughter. And there are more smiles of pleasure and happiness on his face when he is playing with his mentally deficient daughter than anyone else. And then she dies tragically of pneumonia at the age of only 25 in 1948. And de Gaulle and his wife are both distraught. Although they have two very healthy and successful and impressive children as well, still going strong, who will give them grandchildren and great-grandchildren. But how does de Gaulle comfort his beloved wife? He puts his arm around her, and he says, as the pathetic little coffin is being lowered into the grave, and the priest is giving the last sacraments over it, he says, "Do not cry, my darling. At last she is like all the others. At last she is like all the others." Does this man have soul? Does this man have heart? There is a philosopher in France, Jean-Paul Sartre, who stands for everything de Gaulle does not stand for, who is often highly critical of the president, to put it mildly. He also enrages the CIA and the American British deep states. So does de Gaulle, of course. The American government of Lyndon Johnson at the height of the Vietnam War put serious pressure, threats even, to the government of France that they must jail Sartre as an example to the rest and to shut him up. Now, de Gaulle does not share any of the political or philosophical views of Sartre at all, but he recognizes his stature. And he recognizes where Sartre stands in the general history of France. And what does de Gaulle reply to the American ambassador and also to his own, those who are ready to yield to American pressure on this issue in his own government? One does not jail Voltaire. Again, less than half a dozen words in French. Less than half a dozen words, not a long, orotund, endless, boring speech by Churchill. Bam! You've got it. It's the essence of how he sees Sartre. It's the essence of how he sees himself. It's the essence of how he sees the concept of civilization as filtered through the great traditions of France. One does not jail Voltaire. It is beneath the great traditions of French Christianity. It is beneath the great traditions of French humanism. What did we see through the 20th century, second half, after the development of thermonuclear weapons? We saw a confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union, eagerly fanned by the most sinister forces in both countries. And only now we're still learning how sinister those forces in the United States itself were, led by General Curtis LeMay, Alan Dulles, and so many of our other all too familiar friends. And the far too overestimated figure of Dwight Eisenhower, which might be another subject to go into on a future occasion, looking at what was behind the devil behind Eisenhower's smiling face. The devil behind Eisenhower, because it is under Eisenhower that the nuclear confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union come to boiling point, that there is a breakdown of any communication between Nikita Khrushchev and Dwight Eisenhower. It is John Kennedy who, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, high noon fever in the following year, begins the crucial dialogue. And of course, Khrushchev responds, and both of them are removed from the leadership of their own countries. The Soviet leadership removes its leader, who had killed hundreds of thousands of people during directly responsible. That's how he rose to favor under Stalin in his native Ukraine in the 1930s. But it is Khrushchev, who looks like a pig and acts like a pig, who on the Russian side saves the world. And he is removed by due process and is allowed to live out the rest of his life in peace. Poor President Kennedy is martyred by his own side. He has his head blown off. It's a ritual execution in public by a team of at least 4 professional assassins in Dallas, Texas, on November the 22nd, 1963. And de Gaulle had feared it was coming. De Gaulle had feared it was coming. De Gaulle had already, by that point, already survived more than 20 assassination attempts by the British Secret Service, by the French fascists, because he had given up Algeria, and also with the very massive support of the CIA, as he well knew. French counterintelligence was about the best in the world. British counterintelligence and intelligence were both still heavily infiltrated by the Soviets up to 1965. The role of the anarchist leader, Count Peter Kropotkin, in advising and masterminding on this back in the 1930s, in advising Soviet intelligence who and what to target in the British intelligence services, has never been explored. Never. And I've been doing some study on that, so let us consider that for a possible future lecture too. But de Gaulle knows this. French intelligence, there is a joke about the excellence of French perfumes. And I was taught it more than 40 years ago with American friends who loved France, were showing me and my wife around the Palace of Versailles. We were not special guests. We were all just, tourists. But our friends lived in France and, knew the ropes and what have you. And one of our friends said to us, looking around Versailles, here is the largest palace ever built in the modern world. And not a single toilet or system of running water was ever included in it at the time. And our friend then said to us, this explains the great mystery that the whole world has wondered about for hundreds of years. Why is French perfume the best in the world? Because it had to be. Let that sink in. If you have no running water and no toilet systems, your perfume fucking well has to be the best in the world, doesn't it? Jenny, I'm sorry. I don't want you to make you laugh so hard you break a bone or something. But isn't that wonderful? Now, in the same way, why did French intelligence and counterintelligence and presidential security under President Charles de Gaulle be the best in the world as it was? Because it had to be. There were so many people out to get him. The main attack came in 1962. And it's told actually very well in a book which really was British intelligence cover-up to try and, in the public mind, in terms of, soft intellectual power, launder the British state of the stigma of being involved in plots to murder President de Gaulle, which in reality, of course, they were completely up to their neck in. It's that wonderful thriller, The Day of the Jackal, by the late Frederick Forsyth, who has just died. And Forsyth was a former British spook and also a very outstandingly successful Reuters senior journalist at the time in Paris. Notice the two careers ran concurrently, very effortlessly and very smoothly. And his first three classic novels were all on stories that he knew he would never be allowed to write as stories, so he told the truth in fictional form. The Odessa File, about the secret war between the Israeli Secret Service and the Nazi organization of ex-SS men, which was trying to destroy the state of Israel by building rockets with radioactive warheads to bombard on Israeli cities at that time in the 1960s. This was not paranoid. This was real. It was really happening. And incidentally, the Israeli Secret Service officer who was in charge of the assassination of those scientists, which he killed 2 or 3 of them, and that scared the rest out of the country. The operation was a brilliant success. He was, in later years, he was nicknamed, after the movie Dirty Harry came out some years later, this officer was called Dirty Isaac, Dirty Yitzhak, which was his name. We know him in a wider sense as well. He was the future Prime Minister of Israel, Yitzhak Shamir, who also had been head of one of the 2 organizations that bombed the British Empire out of Palestine in the 1940s. And he was probably also not just, we know he gave the order, but when I was first visiting the Middle East and going around Israel as well, at the beginning of the 1970s, the oral tradition, which was very strong in Israel at that time, was Yitzhak Shamir, as head of the Lehi, the Freedom Fighters for Israel, FFI, did not just give the order to have Count Volker Bernadotte, the United Nations Swedish peace negotiator between the Israelis and the Arabs, assassinated. He didn't trust his own people to do it, so he personally went along and with his own Stain gun pumped the two fatal bullets into the heart of the United Nations peace negotiator in 1949. This is the world in which Charles de Gaulle survives 27 assassination attempts. You will see other figures, some less, some more. The most serious of them, which is dramatized very well, best of all in the book, competently well too by Fred Zimmerman in the movie. Zimmerman, incidentally, was also the guy who made High Noon, a guy who made outstanding movies of every kind and ran afoul of the Un-American Activities Committee himself, as all people of courage and bravery seem to have done in the late 1940s and 50s. But while the assassination attempt is shown well there, Forsyth describes it even better. Once again, President de Gaulle is riding with his wife, who he is inseparable from, in his Citroën. And there's a motorcade. But professional paratroops and commandos from the OAS, the secret army organization, which is directly funded by the CIA, and although Alan Dulles has been fired by President Kennedy 2 years before, he's still godfather behind all of it. They carry out the assassination attempt. They pump more than 60 bullets at the president. But the officer commanding the murder attack, who had planned meticulously, completely, made one mistake. And you find this will happen in Iran too, and it will make a mockery of all the bemedaled American generals telling President Trump, who on military issues, on economic issues, and on many other issues, President Trump has been impressive. But when it comes to war, real war, he doesn't have a fucking clue. He's out of his depth. He's out of his comfort zone. He believes the shit that he swallows on Fox News, which is why Pete Hegseth, God help us, is still Secretary of Defense. They think you can press your little buttons, and it's back with your devastating work on artificial intelligence, Matt, and Cynthia's, and on game theory. They have their little game theories, and everything has to go along with the game. And once you say, as Vo Nguyen Giap said, or as we should see de Gaulle kept saying, the rules of the game are irrelevant. We walk through the rules of the game. We see the world in different perspectives than you. The walls that you see, the inevitabilities you see, are just products of your own imagination. They aren't real. Therefore, we ignore them. It all falls apart. What fell apart in the assassination attempt against President de Gaulle in 1962? They used the wrong almanac. They planned the attack at the beginning of twilight, when they would not be seen until it was too late by outriders of President de Gaulle's motorcade. They planned to riddle his car with bullets, just as President Kennedy was killed the following year. But they used the wrong almanac. They used the almanac for 1962 rather than 1963, so there was a difference of between 7 to 11 minutes in when the sun went down. The sky became darker earlier than they expected, so many of their shots missed. Several of them did, in fact, riddle the car. And this was why, when the head of the gang, there was huge pressure from the American embassy to pardon the killer who was responsible, a man who had killed many people in his career in the French army and in the OAS far more afterwards, who'd been involved in terrorism, a man who deserved to die. But he was gallant. He believed he was working for France. All the usual fake shit that the fake armchair liberals and the fake armchair patriots on both sides always fill you with when they try to justify what should be unjustifiable. President de Gaulle was relentless. The bastard must die, not because he tried to kill me, but because he tried to kill me when my wife was in the car, and she could have been killed too. For a 19th century gentleman with a conception of honor, that women and children needed to be protected where possible. This was the ultimate betrayal of an officer's code and of a code of honor and of a gentleman's code of honor. So de Gaulle did not hesitate. When the officer in question was lined up before a firing squad of young French conscripts, the fool said, "This will not happen. None of them will raise a finger to shoot me." And of course, they all did. What President de Gaulle was also doing was he was a brilliant intellectual. Sartre even recognized this. And the greatest literary genius and great philosophical figure as well, I would maintain, became his lifelong friend, his biographer, and his minister of culture, André Malraux. Now, again, Malraux is another of those towering European intellectuals who nobody in the Anglophone world has ever heard of. And there are two books by him you have to read. With my aging memory, I even forget one of them. But the key one is Man's Estate, as it's translated into English. There's a novel he writes about the Spanish Civil War, where he fought as a very brave aviator. He was a Hemingway who was real. He wasn't a fake, phony, tough, and absurd, useless alcoholic bag of shit and abuser of women like Hemingway was. Malraux was a real hero, a brave man, an extraordinary writer. And in Man's Estate, the theme is the crushing of the Chinese Communist Revolution in Shanghai by the fascist forces of Chiang Kai-shek, backed by the Western banks, in conditions of unbelievable brutality and sadism and torture and horror, which Malraux personally witnessed. And the hero of the novel dies heroically at the end of the novel. Well, it's a French novel in the 1920s. What else can you expect? But in real life, it was Malraux's best friend who, among the Chinese idealistic resistance leaders in Shanghai, who he used as a model for his hero in the Human Condition, La Condition Humaine, which is its correct title in French. And this figure is later known through history. He becomes, of all things later, a friend of Henry Kissinger's. We remember him too. Zhou Enlai, the number two in command behind Mao Zedong in the Chinese Revolution and Communist Party, from the 1920s all the way through to his death around 1975. The man who is still loved and revered in China today as being seen as the humane and human figure, which he wasn't always. He could be more ruthless than the worst of them. And there's nothing more ruthless than any communist you give power to. There really isn't. But Zhou was both a brilliant figure and a witty figure. And I have a friend who probably is still alive to this day, who met Zhou in 1968, 1972, in Beijing. Retired United States Ambassador Charles Chaz Freeman, who translated many of the key conversations between Zhou and Henry Kissinger. Although Kissinger spoke no Chinese, of course, he did speak fluent French. Zhou spoke fluent French, but because it was state business, they stuck to Chinese and English and used their own professional translators between them. And there was a famous exchange between them when Kissinger, who on top of everything else is always the professor of history, always the eager intellectual, and he asked Zhou, well, from a Chinese perspective, what do you think of, what's your opinion of the French Revolution? And Zhou replied very famously, too soon to say. Now, exactly, everyone takes this as a brilliant joke by Zhou, right? He's talking about the French Revolution of 200 years earlier, and he says it's too soon to say, make sense of it. But my friend who was there, who remembered the context in which the question was asked, said, no, that isn't what happened at all. Henry was asking him about the French Revolution of 1789, yes, but Zhou misunderstood him. He thought Henry was asking about the student riots in France against President de Gaulle in 1969. And that's why he said too soon to say. So it was taken by Kissinger, who got it wrong, and by the West as a sign of thoughtful. You know, the Chinese are thoughtful. They take the long term. They don't really care about what happens today. The true philosopher has his head on the clouds. No, Zhou was a practical politician who had survived at the top of the Chinese Communist Party under Mao Zedong for 40 or 50 years. He had survived wars and purges and civil wars and plots and intrigues in which millions of people had died. This guy was street smart. When we come back to President de Gaulle, we find the same thing. De Gaulle, especially later in his career, when he can take the long-term view, he's like Bismarck. He's Olympian. He looks back and says, I always knew it was like this. I had the vision to see it was like that. There's truth to this. But he was always street smart too. When the Cuban Missile Crisis appalls de Gaulle, ironically, it was President Kennedy, who he personally held in the highest regard, who, without realizing it, provoked de Gaulle and hardened his determination to leave NATO. De Gaulle then took the firm view, we cannot trust the United States. It is not just that we cannot trust the United States to indefinitely defend us, because it's an English-speaking power. They will always favor the British. They will always have their own interests. Therefore, we must have our own nuclear deterrent. He did believe that, but there was something more. He felt, my God, even Kennedy, who is the most culturally sensitive, sympathetic personally sympathetic American leader I have ever dealt with. Remember, Truman had no time for de Gaulle. Truman had no time for de Gaulle. He thought he was a has-been. Roosevelt hated de Gaulle. Thought he might become another Hitler, which is absurd. Absurd. But he really did hate de Gaulle. And then there was Eisenhower, who was bland and superficially responsible, but had basically treated de Gaulle with contempt in the 1940s, and de Gaulle never forgot it. And suddenly there was Kennedy with a beautiful French-speaking wife, Kennedy who was dignified, Kennedy who had class, who had style, who had charm, and who had a sense of history, who was well-read in history, deeply well-read in history, and de Gaulle responded to this. But even Kennedy, young and inexperienced, had brought the world, it seemed to him, to the brink of thermonuclear war in 1962. And then de Gaulle approved of what Kennedy did afterwards. He deeply approved of Kennedy reaching out to Khrushchev. He facilitated it. And this is another crucial lesson, an example we have from de Gaulle, that the world must never be allowed to descend into a frozen, polarized, bipolar relationship between two ultra superpowers that ignore the rest of the world and play demented games of chess, thermonuclear chess, between themselves. He saw this between the United States and the Soviet Union. He would have seen it between Britain, NATO, and the United States being pulled along as well against China, and countries like Russia allied to China. He was opposed to that. No, said de Gaulle, we want a multipolar world in balance where nation blocks do not simply see each other hardened between one and the other. That's zero-sum. You see this kind of zero-sum thinking, and it's suicidal. It will destroy the state of Israel. It will destroy it. No question about this, unfortunately. And I do not want to see that happen, and it will destroy the Middle East, the Arab societies there too. And Iran might even survive this, but in a radicalized, horrific way, whereas Iran, up to a few weeks ago, was evolving towards the peaceful dissolution. Iran was heading towards where the Soviet Union went in 1989, the peaceful dissolution of a once radical dictatorship. It was on the brink of it. It was Trump and Netanyahu, by provoking this crisis and by bombing Tehran, that turned the clock back and re-radicalized Iran, not just to 1979-80 levels, but to levels, as we shall see, that will go far beyond that. And the president has just come out in the last 24 hours, as I speak, the US president, with wild, sweeping, contemptuous allegations towards the entire Islamic faith, towards a faith which is followed by close to 2 billion human beings on this planet. Have you ever come across a more stupid, irresponsible, reckless idea? What are these people thinking of? Well, it's pretty obvious they're not thinking of anything, really. And if they are, there are demented forces putting their ideas in their head. There are demented forces putting their ideas in their head. De Gaulle was opposed to all of this. De Gaulle said, if you are going to have a bipolarized world, then world catastrophe is inevitable. That is why de Gaulle said a third force is necessary. That is why France as a nation needs its force de frappe, its independent nuclear deterrent. Of course, we will be vastly smaller than the Soviet and American nuclear arsenals, and we do not intend to get into an arms race with them. We do not intend to bankrupt the people of France and the French state by ludicrously trying to outbuild America or trying to unbuild Russia. Which brings us to another point, which is very un-Trumpian. Charles de Gaulle, like Margaret Thatcher after him in Britain, believed in a balanced budget. He believed in states living within their own means. The French had already bankrupted themselves in the Fourth Republic, not just trying to keep their colonial empire, but by trying to crush it militarily in the two terrible wars of Indochina in the 1950s, and prior to that, in the early 1950s, in the hideous most awful of torture wars of both sides, unbelievable atrocities being committed again there in Algeria in the early and mid-1950s. The great British historian Alistair Horn, one of that incredibly tiny handful of privileged British and American scholars who loves France, who respects France, who took France seriously, with a classic work on this called A Savage War of Peace, on the Algerian War. And it is de Gaulle who ends that war. And here's another lesson from de Gaulle. De Gaulle is a peacemaker. And what do you need to be a peacemaker? What are the real experience and qualifications you need? You need to be a successful combat commander and battlefield general to begin with. First, because that teaches you the way the world really is. Secondly, because it gives you the stature to impose peaceful policies that would never be swallowed by anybody else. And here are the examples in American history. George Washington, Ulysses S. Grant, General Zachary Taylor, now forgotten, but should have been remembered in this time, who tried to prevent the Civil War and might well have done so had he not died of arsenic poisoning, which we are told actually came from natural arsenic in the earth. Well, I know a bridge in Brooklyn that I'll sell you cut price for only about $50,000 cash or in gold bullion, no questions asked. And please, it's a great deal. You own the Brooklyn Bridge. All you need to do is give me the money and believe that General Zachary Taylor died of natural causes. Eisenhower himself, arguably, although he built up the ghastly military-industrial complex in America, the only man possibly capable of reining it in. President Kennedy tried, and look what happened to him. And de Gaulle fits this improbable tradition. Generals have also usually have seen war, know the fear and uncertainty of battle and stress of it, and don't want to go through it again. The outstanding, most senior British general of World War II, who almost never mentioned anywhere, largely forgotten outside military specialists, he was Montgomery's boss, and he protected Montgomery. And he recognized Eisenhower was useless and full of shit. And he was, of course, a Northern Ireland man, General Sir Alan Brooke, who became Lord Alan Brooke. And Alan Brooke writes in a letter to his wife in 1942-43, and he's raised up Montgomery. He's protected Montgomery against all the mediocrities and little assholes who were jealous of him and didn't understand him and hated him and were good old boys in the British upper class useless way. And he opposes all of these people, right? And Alan Brooke sees Montgomery fighting battle after battle and never getting tired. And he was an outstanding battlefield commander himself. He had saved the British Army in 1940 thanks to de Gaulle, as we're about to see. He commanded the retreat to Dunkirk when the top British generals, General Gort, and the other top British commanders were panicky, useless, worthless pieces of crap falling apart from nervous exhaustion. Alan Brooke and Montgomery, along with General Sir John Dill, were the trio who brought the British Army back to the Dunkirk perimeter and enabled it to escape via the sea. So he was an outstanding commander, Alan Brooke, under pressure. But what does he say? He says, no one who has not commanded in battle can understand the enormous pressures and uncertainties and fear that go even with the best prepared forces and the best trained troops and the finest officers and the finest equipment. There is so much uncertainty there. You have to have the temperament to deal with that. And then he added, therefore, he never lost a battle. But what did he say? He said, I don't like commanding battles. People say I'm good at it, and he was outstanding at it, but I don't like fighting a battle. I think Monty does. Patton, of course, was like that too. When you have generals who are not gung-ho fools, who do make the changes under pressure that they need, and of course Germany was amply provided with such people fighting often in the worst of causes in both world wars. But when you have that kind of temperament, you are really going to win. Ulysses Grant had it. Charles de Gaulle had it, and there are the escape of the British Army from Dunkirk in 1940 has become, of course, a great aspect of legend. But why did it happen? It happened because the German army stopped for 48 crucial hours when they could have cut the British off from behind and stopped them right there. And there are crucial myths told about this. The most crucial one, which was popularized by the American Jewish popular novelist Herman Wouk in The Winds of War, a book that sold, I think, more than 40 million copies. If anybody could look up the exact figure and give it to me, please do. I'd be grateful. But it came out in the late 1970s. It was made a world phenomenon television series starring Rob. He is actually a bad writer. But when your hero who is a ridiculous, pompous figure and completely empty in the novel, but when he's played in the movie TV version very cannily and sympathetically by Robert Mitchum, then of course that gives it credibility. And that gave credibility back to the book. Wouk popularized the view, and of course the old German generals loved this. We could have won the war in 1940. We could have scooped up the British army. Then they would have had to surrender. This is true. Why didn't they do it? Well, it's all Hitler's fault. Well, no, it wasn't. We now know. The man who took the crucial decision was the German commander in the West, who was in general an outstanding commander, but he was also by the book and a bit cautious, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt. He was so competent that Hitler fired him 3 times, and on 2 of those occasions felt he had to bring him back to reinstate him because he needed him so much, that everything was always worth when you fired von Rundstedt than when you listened to him, right? Von Rundstedt really knew his stuff, but he stopped the German army and Hitler went along with that. Hitler deferred to von Rundstedt's professional opinion. But why did von Rundstedt do it? Because Charles de Gaulle made him. Charles de Gaulle launched an attack called the Battle of Arras in the German drive at the end of May 1940. Now, again, in Anglo-American historiography, this is treated as a joke. De Gaulle was not a top French general. There are more than 200 French generals more senior than de Gaulle at the time. He had just been promoted by a sympathetic prime minister who admired him, Paul Reynaud, to be a brigadier general. And Reynaud, right after this, in fact, brought him back to be deputy minister of war in Paris. De Gaulle was laughed at and sneered at and despised by the entire French military establishment. But there was another French military establishment which did not sneer at or despise him at all, because they had learned all their crucial operational lessons and strategic concepts from him. The German General Staff. In the 1920s, de Gaulle writes a book, The Tank in Battle. He called the book's original title is actually called in French, Towards the Army of the Future. There are different translations in English, and it's difficult to get in English, but Peter is right. Go for it. Go for it. There he develops the theory of blitzkrieg and armored war, which the Germans themselves had not. The Germans had come up with aspects of blitzkrieg, and especially the use of stormtroopers and short bursts of artillery fire to punch holes in enemies' lines unexpectedly at the end of World War I. They tactically worked, but strategically they always failed. There was no force or punch or weight to follow through the initial breakthrough, which is why Ludendorff's enormous offensives of 1918 were all doomed to failure from the beginning. People who say Blitzkrieg was a German conception, or it was a conception then, are wrong. Nor was it an English conception, which Basil Liddell Hart in particular, a pathetic and ridiculous, strange, phony of a man. who also loathed Montgomery. Basil Hart is to military critics of generals what the New Yorker famous movie critic Pauline Kael was to movie directors, always sneering at the best ones and utterly useless themselves. Woody Allen said of Pauline Kael, she had every quality a movie critic needed: wit, intellect, fashionableness. She only lacked one quality, Woody Allen said: taste. Clint Eastwood was even more succinct, as is his style. She sneered at his movies. He said, "Why should I care? She's just a bag of shit." That's it. So much for Pauline Kael. That was Basil Liddell Hart as military theorist and god figure to the British military and American military establishment, which he was until his death in the 1960s. And he gave De Gaulle no understanding or credit at all. He came up with a happy theory that you punch your tanks through enemy lines and then the tanks go everywhere, and he called it the expanding torrent. Nigel Hamilton, the British historian, says this actually goes back to Basil Liddell Hart's sexual inadequacies, his disastrous first marriage, and his notorious obsession with keeping his second wife in too tight corsets at the time, and his own premature ejaculation problems. Now, this is very Freudian, of course, but when you look at it, it's like this and the ideas they come up with. You have to say, well, why not? My God, right? You have to say, why not? And my God. By contrast, what do you find when you read De Gaulle? You find in De Gaulle what the Germans actually did. You have integrated three-dimensional warfare in which on the ground you have tanks and artillery and ground infantry all moving together, integrated way. The infantry have to clear the way for the tanks. The tanks do not clear the way for the infantry. All the people who watch movies like Patton or Fox News are military illiterates, and they get it back to forth. Infantry is crucial for the breakthrough. It's only after that that you send the tanks through. And you have to use artillery as well, and you have to have air superiority. You don't need it on the whole front. In 1940, the French had more than 1,000 more aircraft than the Germans did. But they kept them scattered around the whole lines. They never were able to organize their own air forces for tactical superiority. De Gaulle understood this. And the only time he has a chance to practice his own theories in practice as a French local military commander, it works. He is the only French general in the entire vast French army who ever counterattacks against the Nazis and in their drive into France, and it has the most profound repercussions. According to American and British fake history, according to Churchill's fake history, de Gaulle does a pinprick. The Germans shrug it off. No, they are terrified by it. De Gaulle comes close to cutting off Guderian's spearheads, and von Rundstedt, he convinces von Rundstedt, he gets inside the mind of the top German commander in battle, that he must not let Guderian run riot to the sea. Now, in fact, Guderian could have done it, because no other French or British commander had the capability to, or no French commander had the nerve and the brains or the wit and the initiative to do what de Gaulle did. And while there were two British commanders who could have done it, Alanbrooke and Montgomery, they were in charge of tiny forces that were preoccupied with saving themselves from the German spearheads. So the only French commander to carry out an attack like this is de Gaulle, and it has a huge disproportionate effect. It's like, what do they call it? The butterfly effect. You know, in chaos theory, a butterfly flaps its wings over Tokyo, and 7 days later, San Francisco and LA are destroyed by freak tsunamis as a direct result. This doesn't happen often in history, but it does happen. These chain reactions are triggered, and this is what happened here. De Gaulle attacks at Arras. He frightens the German high command. Von Rundstedt orders a 2-day pause so that the support forces can drive up and not cut off the leading panzer forces. This was a legitimate concern. The Russians the Soviets repeatedly threatened to do this to the Germans on the Eastern Front in World War II, and on several key occasions, they succeeded. So de Gaulle is again ahead of his time. But what is the result? Churchill is not deposed from being prime minister after 7 days. Britain fights on. Britain survives, and de Gaulle is essential to the survival of England, and he is never given credit for it. But de Gaulle has already saved the West, arguably, on an even more obscure occasion 20 years before this. In 1920, de Gaulle is a young and rising officer in the French army. He was seriously wounded in World War I. He was decorated for gallantry. He already has shown that he is a writer and analyst, vastly superior to virtually any other officer of his generation in the army. And he has actually survived World War I because he was captured by the Germans and held in a prisoner of war camp. Ironically, this saved his life because otherwise, being tall and distinctive and incomparably brave as he was, he would certainly have been killed. But as a young rising officer, he is sent with a French military mission on an impossible job. He is sent to Warsaw in 1920. Winston Churchill's attempt to destroy the infant communist state, it is not yet called the Soviet Union, won't be called that till 1922, but has been completely destroyed. Churchill's money has gone to support raving, white reactionary, vicious, fascist, raping, slaughtering, murdering, Jew massacring forces that discredited the anti-communist cause in Russia. And the Soviet forces under Trotsky are now and Marshal Tukhachevsky are now counterattacking. They are driving towards Poland. Poland has just been created by Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson envisages a peaceful, helpless little Poland under his friend, the pianist Paderewski. As usual, Woodrow Wilson is a mad, ignorant, pathetic, incompetent little loon who has no conception of reality. The Polish state is held together by the one military force capable of it. Doing so, a Polish legion that operated loyally for the Habsburg Empire previously under a man who started World War I as a sergeant, Joseph Pilsudski. He will become known as the Napoleon of Poland, right? He organizes large-scale forces. Both the Russian forces are largely deindustrialized now. They've used up all the shells and heavy artillery and weapons from an unindustrialized start in world before that. The Poles come from an agricultural land background. They're good at putting large forces of untrained horse cavalry into the field. The Russians are overextended. The Poles are extremely brave and numerous, but and organizing fast, but they're also enormously militarily experienced. Pilsudski, who they will claim as their Napoleon, had only been a sergeant in a real army when World War I began. The French send a military mission of advisors to help them. It is arguably the most successful mission of professional military advisors since the Spartans sent their own generals to advise the inhabitants of Syracuse when the idiot Democrats under Alcibiades launch a bungled invasion that it turns out to be a catastrophe that destroys the Athenian fleet and army and ends the golden age of Athens back around 414 BC. And the French mission is actually led by an incompetent, a tiny little, prissy little fellow in an impeccable uniform called General Gamelin. But he has an interesting officer on his staff, Charles de Gaulle, a young captain. De Gaulle never boasts of his... The period that the nature of de Gaulle's service in Warsaw needs much more future study. Literally every serious historian, even the French ones, tend to gloss it over. They take de Gaulle at his own modest estimation. Well, I was there. I was still single. Warsaw society was brilliant. I was a French officer and held in high regard. I had wonderful girlfriends. I had a wonderful time. He also likes the Poles and their swagger, recognizes their military amateurists, despises the large Jewish community of Poland at the time, a view he will later revise with far different French Jews when they become the backbone of the resistance movement loyal to him in World War II, which also shows de Gaulle has most of the prejudices of his time, but is incredibly capable all his life of growing out of them, rising above them, transcending them. But what I simply want to note here is this: the French forces are the French officers guide and organize the Polish forces. They direct them into gaps in the Russian lines. The Russians are sloppy and amateurish. The French advisors make all the difference. The Russians are routed. The Poles counterattack. They counterattack so well that the Polish border for the next 18 years, up to 1939, from 1921 to 1939, is 9 times the size of the Poland that Woodrow Wilson envisaged in 1920. Instead of being a national, a state of national boundaries, a Poland for the Poles, right? Isn't this what national self-determination is supposed to be all about? But no, it becomes what the reality of Versailles 1919 is really all about. 4 or 5 well-organized groups of ruthless minorities enslave everybody around them into far greater misery and slavery and poverty and torture and rape and murder than they had ever suffered under the peaceful and tolerant German and Austro-Hungarian empires in the 250 years before. We are presented to this day with the myth of the Paris Peace Conference and the Treaty of Versailles 1990 as freeing the peoples of Eastern Europe from the evil empires that oppressed them so cruelly. No, those empires were empires of the best of the liberal Enlightenment, which the great German philosopher figures of the 18th century and the great French philosopher figures of the 17th century had brought about. Instead, what do you have? You have a Poland that enslaves Germans, Jews, Ukrainians, Russians mercilessly. The Polish rape of the German minority in Silesia that they occupy is so great that in 1920, the suffering German people of Silesia, now under Polish rule, they don't go to war. They appeal to Woodrow Wilson and they appeal to the League of Nations to redress their grievances and protect them from their Polish occupiers. How much good do you think that does them? Czechoslovakia never exists. The Czechs enslaved the Slovaks, who were a peasant people who had ruled aristocratically but perfectly humanely by their Hungarian overlords for 900 years. They had nothing in common with the Czechs to the west. For the next 20 years, the Czechs treat them as slaves. They treat them as badly, arguably worse than American slave owners treated black people up to the Civil War. And this is common talk in the Czech culture of the time. When I first met Czech emigres in England, who are even experts on Central European history in the late 1960s and early 70s, when they taught me, this racist contempt for the Slovak people came across even then. And this explains why Czechs are cowards and armorers. They never rose against the Germans in World War II. They built 20,000 Messerschmitts for them and were well paid for doing so at the Skoda works. The Czechs built twice as many combat fighters, Messerschmitt 109s, for the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, in World War II than German industry built at home itself. By contrast, the largest and most militarily important and successful military uprising of the war was the Slovak rebellion that opened the Carpathian passes to the Red Army in the winter of 1944, and 50,000 brave Slovak soldiers died during it. Charles de Gaulle is introduced to these complexities when he is in Warsaw in 1920. He sees them firsthand. It guides his skepticism and caution about sweeping adventurism in Eastern Europe after the war. It helps him recognize that Russian supremacy over Eastern Europe, while not desirable in the long term, and certainly not helpful to European civilization as a whole, is not the worst thing that has happened or could happen to the peoples of Eastern Europe. It informs his understanding. He recognizes Eastern Europe is complex. It builds into his own later Ostpolitik, his successful developing of relations with Moscow in the 1960s. Here is a man who is not looking as Woodrow Wilson looked, to create a new world for the next 1,000 years. Nor is he looking backward like Winston Churchill looked, to preserve the British Empire in all its perfection and beauty and glory and justice. I don't think. for the next 1,000 years, as Churchill really thought he was doing. Here is a man who, in his time, is only looking to the problems of his time and coming up with solutions to them. And yet we find today, 46 years after he died, the lessons he taught us are crucial to the survival of humanity and the prosperity of the human race in general, and the people of not just of France, but of Europe in general, going on afterwards. And yet, I close here, but I close with the paradoxes of De Gaulle. De Gaulle is a French nationalist. And he is he as a conservative. And yet he is technologically a man of the future. His self-vision is of an 18th and 19th century officer. Some of his own intimates speculate that he either was or at least believed himself to have been a reincarnation of an officer who served in the Royal French armies of Louis XIV. He's that kind of man. His personal manners are impeccable. And yet, he also dissolves rural, backward France. He creates a new, technological, forward-looking France. He is in favor of nuclear weapons, but he opposes an out-of-control nuclear arms race. He is in favor of the development of nuclear civilian power. The key work for this has already been done in a pioneering way under the technocrats of the Fourth Republic. But under de Gaulle, who could have shut it down, or like the British, could have made every stupid decision imaginable, the British at the same time under Macmillan, his exact contemporary, developed an all-British new nuclear reactor, the AGR, the Advanced Gas-Powered Reactor. It is a fiasco. It soaks in all the technological brain power, such as it is, of the British physics and chemistry establishments of their day, and it sucks in all the still relatively generous research resources of the British state when it was still the fourth or fifth largest economy in the world in the 1950s and early 60s, and it wastes them all. By contrast, the French under de Gaulle develop their own PWRs, their pressured water reactors. And the French reactors are safe, successful, reliable, continue to work to this day, which explains why even under the idiot Macron, France is spared the worst of the unbelievable deindustrialization policies and green policies that the wild environmentalist romantics, and of course they have them out vastly in France too, but de Gaulle stands against such people. He stands against deindustrialization. He stands for nuclear power. He stands for the use of nuclear energy. He stands for an industrialized Europe. And he opposes the European Union in Brussels. He opposes any kind of supranational state that is not subject to restraint or oversight or control and budgetary direction by the peoples of different countries and by the democratically accountable peoples of different countries. He also opposes out-of-control immigration. He welcomes into France the veteran Algerian soldiers and their families who fought loyally for France in the war against Algeria, and who, had they saved, would have been raped and tortured and dismembered to death, as all those who stayed were, by the victorious revolutionaries in Algeria. But he opposes what his successors bring in, which is uncontrolled mass immigration into France. He prophesies, and again he is right, that this will destabilize France, that it will destroy the nature of French society and civilization and culture, and that it will cause enormous problems of law and order and security, especially to the old and the women and the children, the weak. Because again, de Gaulle is not a knight in the negative Templar sense of the term, but he does believe in knighthood. He even creates his own sacred order of the French Republic, which basically grows out of the French resistance. He believes in the responsibility of aristocrats and the rich and the wealthy and the military strong to protect the pure. Now, there is much more I can say about this admirable and extraordinary man, but I've gone on at least 30 minutes beyond schedule, predictably as usual. So, led by you, folks, please feel free to weigh in here. But as I say, the examples I close with are this. This is not a man like Woodrow Wilson who says, I will change human nature. I will redraw the maps of Europe as they have never been redrawn since the days of Charlemagne or of the Roman Empire. I am not a figure who will transcend human nature, which the mad and repulsive and ridiculous Woodrow Wilson did. Nor is he an arch reactionary like Churchill, who says 46 million British rule over 400 million Indians and treat them like shit, and this is the way it must be through eternity. And this is the way it must be through eternity. He does not endlessly look back in this morally bankrupt, stupid, arrogant, empty, repulsive ways of the colonialists either. De Gaulle deals with the issues of his own time, but he does so in ways and with methodologies and with solutions that are essential to our survival and revival as peoples, as a civilization, to our spiritual regeneration too in the 21st century. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marty. That was extraordinary, as I expect from you nowadays. I you
Frighteningly high standard, Matt.
no, I
Rated.
mean, honestly, this is it's always a treat to listen to you, and I appreciate this so much. I got the one quick question for you. I don't know if you've done any research on, well, two questions, then we'll go to people who have lined up in queue to pick your brain. Number one, could you say a little bit more about his how he was able to kick NATO out of France? I know they had to go to Belgium as its headquarters, but it was a fight. I don't know if you could speak to that at all. And number two, his ouster in 1969, which seemed to have been, people taking to the streets, especially a lot of young people who felt like they were being very revolutionary in this mass protest that broke out all across France, demanding his ouster, which happened. It smells a little bit like a color revolution, and I've never found anybody who's really proven that. Though, from what we know about how color revolutions are organized and how young people are often weaponized because they have a lot of energy, not a lot of experience or understanding, they can easily be wielded and deployed. It seems like that's the case, but I don't know if you have encountered any research that has helped corroborate that hypothesis that it was a foreign organized color revolution to oust him and break his grand designs for for the world. So those two things, could you speak to that?
Yes, certainly. Largely from my own ignorance and from my own competence, but sometimes ignorance is vitally important too, is crucially important too, because we have to know what we don't know before we can know what to look for. And Stephen, I'm looking at you at this because you're my Socrates here. You're always asking the questions that I never thought to ask, and I don't think anybody else ever did either. And here it applies again from you, Matt. No, but as far as I know, nobody has ever looked at this. I was around at the time. I was not an expert, of course, but I was watching BBC News. That makes you a global world expert. Well, all the people I went to Oxford with believe it still does to them. They believe that they still understand the world better than Socrates or Descartes or De Gaulle or Roosevelt could ever understand the world because they watch the BBC News every night. There's insight for you. And of course, on British media, and most of all American media too, these questions are never asked, and they were not asked at the time. There is an immediate knock-on effect from the American Revolution. Kids in France and across Europe, and I saw this in Britain at the time too, looked at the television screens, looked at the riots against Vietnam in America, and said, we want to do that too. There is certainly an element of that. But of course, such people are very easily manipulated. Very easily manipulated. I personally believe, based on what I have learned from you and what I have just learned by going back and looking more critically at things I never thought to look critically at before, I have done no research in this. The research urgently needs to be done because I believe it is true. De Gaulle is toppled from power in 1969. Effectively, he puts the revolution down. It's a fake revolution. It's highly dubious to begin with, but he has politically been greatly wounded. And let us also remember he's old at the time. He's 78 going on 79 years old. He has not picked as well as we would like to have done. Georges Pompidou fundamentally succeeds in keeping peace in France, no small achievement, in keeping prosperity in France, economic development in France. But he likes his bizarre sexual tastes, and therefore he is very easily manipulable by different deep states. There is always that question hanging over Pompidou. Yet Pompidou is loyal to keeping France out of NATO. Let us give him that. And he does so throughout the 1970s. He dies in 1974. Giscard d'Estaing, a much more formidable and able figure, takes over, and he is very much loyal in the fundamentalist ways, both to the West in general, but also to the Gaullist heritage in particular. One aspect of this I can speak to, and that is the central role of the French independent nuclear deterrence. The Americans are opposed to it throughout. They hate it like poison. They want America to maintain the nuclear deterrent. And in a way, it's the opposite of today. We have a bizarre, sinister situation today where a strange little, evil, bizarre little creep in Kiev, who was installed there by the West, who has no democratic legitimacy whatsoever, who runs a brutal fascist state that murders women and journalists in Moscow, that kills and tortures at will in his own country. We're talking about Zelensky, of course. And yet he has all the leaders of NATO and Europe dancing on his strings. And then they come to America and they tell the president of the United States, macho man Donald Trump himself, what to do. And Trump magically melts to them on every occasion. What is going on here? Now, under a rational explanation, we would say the British are pulling his strings and the City of London. Now, that may be true. But I believe it goes in the other way too, that there's a demonic aspect to this, a literal demonic aspect. And for that, you had to be in Washington in 2022, as I was, and witness with your own eyes the extraordinary scenes of literal hysteria on in the Congress. And don't take my word for this. Everybody here, it's bound to be still on YouTube. Nobody will have bothered wiping it out yet because they don't realize what it's really revealing. Look at the scenes of mass adulation for the first time. He's done it often since, of course, but the first time Vladimir Zelensky appears to Congress. Where on Easter Sunday, they would have stoned Jesus, but they welcomed Zelensky. What does that tell you? What should that portend? What should that tell you? Now, De Gaulle wouldn't fall for that because he's an old-fashioned Catholic Christian, a man of high, respectable, and serious moral standards. And as you say, the street revolution takes him up in 1969. I have seen no academic evidence that the agency was behind this, let alone British intelligence. I've seen none. And the real architecture of destabilizing states in an orchestrated, ongoing nature really comes later. It's developed in the 1990s, and it reaches fruition in the first, the first decade of this 21st century. And now we can recognize it. The Institute for the International Republican Institute, the Institute for the Promotion of Democracy. I paraphrase the name slightly, but there's a Republican Institute to promote democracy around the world. There's a Democratic Institute. Notice again, this fits your classic prediction and model, and I think I see you nodding your head in recognition already, Matt. You set up a false dichotomy with both sides really on the same side. And everybody thinks they only have the false dichotomy. Just as all the idiot intellectuals of the 1930s thought you had to choose communism to escape from fascism and Nazism. The idea that there could be third ways was beyond them. De Gaulle offered that third way. Therefore, he had to go. But the actual institution of reliably toppling regimes around the Western world, I think, comes a lot later. But on the other hand, they've been doing it to Mossadegh in 1953 in Iran, the source of all our woes today. They've been doing it in Central America, more of our woes today, in 1954 in Guatemala. They were already old hands of this. I think the archdemon devil Dulles, Alan Dulles himself dies in 1968, or is it 1969? That wouldn't be too late for him to have personally approved moves to do this. It would have been done with the blessings of the British, of course, who hated de Gaulle like poison. It would have been done with Lemnitzer's blessing. We already know the Gladio people were up and running in Italy and in Belgium and carrying out their own dark forces at that time. So I do not have evidence of this hard and fast. The context is extremely likely and suggestive. Work needs to be done. The most crucial essence of mind manipulation in these areas is something even Orwell did not see. He was too honest and straightforward, but Aldous Huxley did. If you don't bring a subject up, if people do not even imagine the subject exists, they will not go looking for it. The first thing we have to do is what you have just done. Ask the question. So yes, I think he was toppled. You have, and the other thing is how quickly this passed. You have 1 million people on the streets of Paris demanding de Gaulle must go in 1968. De Gaulle is cool. He rides it out in the short term. The silent France, what Nixon rightly called the silent minority in America, comes flooding into Paris from all over France at the time. The army is totally loyal. And yet he is so politically crippled, within a year he is gone and has to be gone. That's the first point. As to getting out of NATO, the key battle there, I believe, is fought again. We've already discussed it. The key battle is keeping President de Gaulle alive. He has control over the institutions of the French state. The army is loyal to him. Most crucially, the Gaullist intelligence services are elite and loyal to him. And ironically, there's a very good description of how this happens, even from one of their arch opponents in the novel. You won't find it in the book, of course, but in the movie. Movies don't go into this kind of detail, but in the novel The Day of the Jackal by Frederick Forsyth, there's an excellent discussion of the institutions of law and order under the French Republic and of the loyalty and passion of the people who de Gaulle used. De Gaulle did something poor Kennedy did not realize he had to do, and that Harry Truman, even who loathed Kennedy, recognized. Truman said right after Kennedy's assassination, Kennedy failed to realize you have to have the deep state. It wasn't the phrase he used, but that's the he was referring to. The intelligence services of the country, the secret services, on your side, and you must not threaten to topple them, or that will be the end of you, not them. Because you're just an individual and they are an institution. And even if you've 1 or 2 people, you've got to change the institution. Per President Kennedy was naive in that he'd been a heroic and decorated war officer, but he had no background in dealing with the secret state. He fell for this. He thought it was enough to pardon Allen Dulles. He didn't realize all the people Allen Dulles had put in charge still reported to Allen Dulles loyally. De Gaulle did not make that mistake. He put in his own people as heads of the SDECE, the best intelligence service in the world. He made French counterintelligence and presidential security the best in the world. Even Frederick Forsyth acknowledges that in 1962, President de Gaulle sent a French team of his own top security experts to Washington to advise the Secret Service because President de Gaulle already had reliable intelligence from the United States that the American deep state was going to assassinate President Kennedy. Neither Kennedy nor his Secret Service chiefs paid any time. They treated the French with disrespect. They thought they were just ignorant little frogs who lost World War II and are trying to make themselves self-important. They didn't know from fucking shit, and so they lost their own president. The French experts who were world-class, who had saved and protected President de Gaulle already from more than 20 assassination attempts at that point, went back to the President of France and told him the President of the United States is unlikely to survive his first term. The security around him is amateurish and abysmal. They allow him to go around openly standing in an open target for everyone. The security people allow themselves to get drunk every night when they're supposed to be alert and guarding the president the next morning. They sleep with women right, left, and center, which means that everybody knows and who wants to know will know in advance where the security detail and the president will be every moment of the next day. It is a fiasco, Monsieur le Président. It is a fiasco. And de Gaulle and his people tried to warn Kennedy, but they failed to. But this is why he succeeds in NATO above all. He has the loyalty of his own deep state behind him. He has the loyalty of his own military behind him. He is the de Gaulle of 1940. He is the de Gaulle of Battle of Arras. He is the de Gaulle of the Free French and the Resistance. He is the de Gaulle who prevented the communist takeover of France in 1944. He is the grand liberator who, in 1944, he enters Notre Dame, one of the great moments of modern French history, to celebrate Paris free, as he says. And there are still German snipers and pro-German fascist snipers lurking in the belfries of Notre Dame, and they shoot at the president. And everybody dives to the ground, right, very sensibly for cover, except one man. And ironically, several of the greatest appreciators of de Gaulle, none of them are American, but several of them are English and British. And one of the best of them is the late Malcolm Muggeridge, whose memoirs of the first half of the 20th century, Chronicles of Wasted Time, I hugely recommend to everyone here. It's a wonderful book exposing the Fabians, exposing the Appeasers, exposing the League of Nations, and he also exposes Churchill. He meets Churchill in 1948 on behalf of the late 40s, when he's in opposition, on behalf of the London Daily Telegraph to negotiate a deal for the very lucrative publication of Churchill's memoirs. And how does Muggeridge find the great God King of the West? He said, I conceived an image of utter repulsion. He was old, he was fat, his flesh was rotting, he was disgusting, he was filled with the most obscene and ridiculous and contemptible attitudes. His jealousy towards President Roosevelt was palpable. By contrast, how does this same Muggeridge, an arch skeptic in his life, see President de Gaulle? He was in Notre Dame during de Gaulle's visit. He said, they all died to the ground, Americans, British, French alike. The collaborators, the Free French, all of them. The military and the civilians. One man stood there, fearless, ignoring it all. That, to me, was the essence of de Gaulle, the essence of the man. Standing there, fearless, but looking to the future, afraid of nothing, unstoppable by nothing, when all around him were diving to the floor.
Richard Moore.
Thank you so much, Martin. That was just really amazing and so informative. And you're in very good form today. Thank you.
Heaven knows why or how. I haven't touched any alcohol yet. I haven't even touched any coffee so far this morning. It must all be adrenaline, Richard. Go ahead, please.
Did you have a question, Richard?
No, I just wanted to say that. I mean, sometimes okay. I have pushbacks with Martin, but not today.
Right.
I'm sorry, your pushbacks always teach so much, and they're always a joy. Please,
Bruce, are you up? Are you still there?
Yes. Ditto what Richard just said, and kind of like a lightning round here, Martin. The Chronicle book you just mentioned and recommended, the title and the author?
Chronicles of Wasted Time. 2 volumes. Oh, there's also a combined volume version. Should be in paperback. By Malcolm Muggeridge, Muggeridge, but do not read it in public if you are on a train or a bus or even at a public meeting, because you will embarrass yourself. You will be laughing out loud, Bruce, on every page. I mean, it is quite wonderful. I mean, he also worked for the British Secret Service in World War II, and the experience drove him to an attempted suicide. He seems to have known everyone. He was a close friend of George Orwell. The throwaway stories are hilarious. I
I
mean,
can't wait.
how
Yeah.
to work as a secret agent in southwestern neutral Africa during World War II. You must know how to make invisible ink from bird droppings. And you must know how to bribe the madams who run the local brothels so you can get all the gossip out of them.
All righty. Thank you. Next quick question. I've never read a book on De Gaulle. I want to. What title comes to mind that you would recommend?
There are many. I would actually start for the easiest one, Brian Crozier, English writer, enormously sympathetic to the president, with an excellent one-volume book. Without question, the best biographer, two-volume biography, Jean Lacouture. If your French is up to it, go to the French because there's much that wasn't included. They said for reasons of space. And I don't even think it was conscious sanitation so much as incompetence. But there's lots more good stuff in the French version. But it's 2 volumes, not one. Jean Lacouture.
Thank you. Thank you. And the one volume by Brian Crozier, you say.
Yes, Lacouture. And finally, I think, I may be wrong in this, but if you look up the works of André Malraux, Malraux, there is also a Conversations with de Gaulle, I think.
Oh, wow. Nice. All right. And now I have the impression from actually recent reading that the United States funded something, maybe I saw 3/4 of the French expense as France was dominating Vietnam again after World War II up until 1954. The United States funding up to 3/4 of that. You reminded me the CIA was behind the OAS and their support of their domination attempt to hold on to Algeria. But it was also France. Besides the CIA, if their support for the suppression or the maintaining control of Algeria was through the CIA, was that something of a secret support, or was it more broadly known that it was public American support of helping France keep and control Algeria? Did that make sense?
Yes. The answer is, in a broad strategic and diplomatic sense, it was no secret. In terms of the details of what was done, we still don't know. It was kept under wraps. A key point is, and this is fascinating too, as we've seen so often since, liberal imperialists were the worst. De Gaulle was hated by my old teacher, for example, Isaiah Berlin, as he saw de Gaulle as fascism returned from the 1930s. All these people then, and a lot of people today, have 1930s fascism on the brain. They see no difference between Mussolini and Hitler. Well, of course, Mussolini himself erased that difference. But when you look at Ataturk, who really was a fascist leader and an autocratic leader by any standards in Turkey in the 1920s and 30s, but he was no Hitler. He was a Franco. And Franco, of course, was no Hitler. He was utterly ruthless in the war and towards his enemies after the war. But then he ruled, the joke that even Frederick Forsyth picked up, and it was common when I first went to Spain, but before the democratic era was, Spanish jails are no joke, but the Spanish won't put you in them unless you really work very hard to persuade them to. And this was true not just for tourists, but by that time for Spanish people as well. Now, like I say, people on the old left really had exaggerated idiotic attitudes towards de Gaulle. But if you look at the 2 terrible wars of the 40s and 50s, like Vietnam and America, they were fought by liberals, they were fought by progressives, they were fought by left-wingers, partly because they thought we are defending civilization and everybody who is not for us must be exterminated. The same attitude we all face in this audience today and are so familiar with. Anyone who disagrees with one world, no borders liberalism must ultimately be worse than Hitler and Stalin combined. Mm-hmm. That's the attitude. But the other attitude was this. France, under the contemptible Third Republic, had lost World War II contemptibly in 1940. It was this right-wing, quote-unquote, fascist leader, de Gaulle, and the military who rebuilt France. This leaves the democratic politicians very insecure. We lost France in 1940. Other people than us liberated it in 1944. We have to show we're Napoleon too. We are the true heirs of the revolution. Duh, duh, duh. So they send an entire generation of French aristocracy and they murder and torture 2 or 3 million people in Vietnam to death to hold on to a country they have no right to hold on to in Southeast Asia and all of Southeast Asia in the early 1950s. And then, of course, even before that, they carried out the same ghastly outrage in Algeria. And that in turn leads to the rise of the really ugly fascist, torturing, neo-Nazi loving extreme right in the OAS, who hate de Gaulle. They recognize de Gaulle is they recognize what the dumb liberal idiots do not. They recognize that it is de Gaulle who stood up against Hitler, who stood up against Stalin, who stood up against the communists, is also the force standing up against any kind of fascist revival, which a lot of people in the CIA and the American military ardently want, as we know at that time. He is the one standing up against this. He is the one standing up against this. So the OAS hates him, but the liberal democratic idiots also hate de Gaulle, and they're the people who plunge France into these two unwinnable wars. Now, de Gaulle himself grows and evolves on this. If you go back to 1946, the great Philippe Leclerc, who I've discussed before here, comes back from Southeast Asia in 1946-47. And he says, we have to have a political solution. We have to give them de facto power. We need basically the British fig leaf solution. Just as the British have been forced to give independence to the white dominions and eventually to India, and the fig leaf that made it acceptable to the British people was, oh, they're still in the British Commonwealth of Nations. We have to give the same de facto independence to Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos. Real independence. And then give under the fig leaf of being under the French Union, which we can give them a few sups, which they need anyway from us. That is the Leclerc solution. And Leclerc dies suspiciously in 1947 in a plane crash in Algeria, as I've discussed before. And he's combating at the time very strongly British efforts through British Petroleum to gain control of Libyan oil and oil that is and gas that are about to be discovered in Algeria, which the geologists understand. And Leclerc is very active in opposing this. So there are different reasons for getting rid of Leclerc. And de Gaulle has some suspicions, I think, about this, but not fully. But on Vietnam, de Gaulle is still superficially, though not wildly enthusiastically, in favor of keeping Vietnam in 1956, but then, Algeria in 1956, but he would have evolved on it. There's no question about that because he evolved on Algeria later, and he makes no attempt whatsoever to try and turn history back. By the way, I discovered an extraordinary example of turning history back. A figure in British history who was so absurd and idiotic and repulsive, even Churchill is frightened by him. And that is Enoch Powell, the future champion of, against immigration. Although he's the man who brings more Pakistani and Muslim and African immigrants into Britain than anyone else in the 1950s to make the National Health Service run. But one of the first things Powell does when Churchill regains power in 1951 is India has only been an independent nation for 4 years. And Powell says to Churchill, very seriously, he says, surely the priority of this new conservative government is to reverse the mistake that the Labour Party made and regain power over India. Re-establish our imperial control over India. After all, Nehru went to Harrow. He's been subjected to a good British education. And they don't have nuclear weapons like we do. They're not a great military power that we still are. Now, this is too much even for the aged Churchill, right? But instead of firing Powell from his government, he lets him stay in. But it's very revealing about the kind of man Powell was. Powell, in fact, later does a complete U-turn and says, oh, we should never go back to the empire, which is a bit more sane. But this is the kind of man he was, and you have to understand it. De Gaulle is the opposite. De Gaulle is still in favor of hanging on to Indochina and establishing French control, but in a sensible way in 46. but he hasn't been there. He hasn't had a chance to listen to the people who are there. He hasn't seen the evolving situation there. He has always been the kind of realist that the great commanding generals always are. They know when to use force, but also they know when not to use force. They know when not to use force. And this is hugely important. I'm not an automatic admirer of David Halberstam, for whom every American conservative is evil and wicked, and who every raving and ranting liberal asshole has saints. Also, Halberstam hates the television show The Beverly Hillbillies, which still gives me a welcome respite from what we call the real world whenever I need it, right? There is that too. I want to do maybe a presentation to us sometime, Matt, the foreign policy of Jade Clampett. How about that?
Martin, thank you. I'm gonna email you a video I dropped in the chat, and I'll wrap it up with
yes,
that.
Bruce,
thank
absolutely.
you, thank you. To give it back to Matt. Thank you very much.
Great. Yeah, I'll put that on the maybe list. Wes has been shooting for some crude for a very long time.
Yes, exactly.
Fold into it. All right. So the next on the list is Stephen. Stephen Doyle. You still there?
Matt, can you hear me from the screen?
Yes, sir.
Okay, just Marty, to pick up on your comment as De Gaulle as the fiscal conservative, and to build on Matt's thought about the color that attempted to get him out. In 71, the French repatriated their gold from the U.S. Shortly afterwards, they're not by the massive gangster. And I'm wondering, to what extent is that French repatriation goal thought to be a post-De Gaulle fiscally conservative move versus it being a coordinated Paris, London bankster attack on financial system and opening up the gates to the petrodollar paradigm?
Okay.
Do you have any insights into that?
A little bit. I'm not entirely certain on this. I was young at the time, and most of what was going on went right past me. But I was in Oxford at that time in 1970-71 when the Heath government came in. And I always had an instinctive revulsion to Heath, which grew considerably more intense afterwards. I never dreamed I could ever support Harold Wilson again, but I voted for him in 1974 just to get rid of Heath. And history has shown since all the more excellent reasons for that. I think it was coordinated, but I think the real sense for it, the sound sense for it, came from Paris. Because the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Heath's Chancellor, Anthony Barber, was a financial illiterate. He was a catastrophe, and he presided over an out-of-control inflation over like 4 years. Taking inflation under control, having a credible gold-based, or at least gold stabilized currency was beyond Heath, and it was beyond Barber. By contrast, Pompidou was a professional banker, and I don't say that to insult Pompidou. He was, I think, like Rishi Sunak tried to be as an underestimated Prime Minister of Britain. And Sunak wasn't a great Prime Minister of Britain. He couldn't be. He inherited an impossible situation, a useless, illiterate, doomed, broken party, eviscerated by the two idiots who had, was it three? No, it was three who had, I exempt David Cameron to some degree from that. But Boris Johnson, the worthless demagogue, Theresa May, who meant well but was plodding and hapless, and that 44-day idiot whose name I even...
Liz Truss.
Thank you. The fact that I forgot her name, and surely someone should remember a lady prime minister called Truss for all the wrong reasons. But I mean, she was a clown. She was an absolute clown. But these people are illiterates. The fact that he had been a banker meant at least he could read a balance sheet. And Anthony Barber could not read a balance sheet, and neither could Edward Heath. Of course, they thought they were superior to everyone who could. And Georges Pompidou could read a balance sheet. So my personal strong sense, and I stand to be corrected on this, I don't have the documentary hard evidence, but I think this had to come primarily from Paris. with sensible forces in the City of London going to Anthony Barber, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the British Finance Minister at the time, and saying, look, Nixon has just fucked up the world, which he had, because this is the start, as Matt has pointed out before, of the great deindustrialization and global financialization policies of completely stripping the West of its industry for cheap short-term profits and monetary gain by the elites, and not caring that hundreds of millions of people in both Europe and North America are being driven into destitution systematically, slowly but steadily. This all starts with Nixon and what you just pointed out, Stephen. So again, you've nailed it. And again, I think you're right. I cannot prove it, but I think it is, you could make the parallel here, I think. The partnership of De Gaulle and Pompidou, the great, wise, genuinely wise leader of sound principles, and the financially adept financier who is widely distrusted, but is certainly a master of the system, echoes a previous generation in America. It echoes President Warren Harding, the most underestimated of presidents and an admirable man. And his, in many respects, sleazy, but in the 1920s, commandingly successful, and at that time generous and humane, a Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Mellon, who bring America out of the catastrophic Great Depression of 1920, which during its time was more frightening than the first 2 years of the Great Depression were a decade later. So I think you have the same parallel, this very effective team of De Gaulle and Pompidou, with Pompidou still carrying out De Gaulle's principles and policies on behalf of France in the early 1970s. And I can tell you from a British perspective, when I was visiting France in those years, the French people, French business, French economy, French public services, French social services were infinitely superior to those of Britain in the 1970s. They were getting that way, and they reached parity with them in de Gaulle's era. And then through the 1970s under both Pompidou and then certainly under Giscard, they vastly outstripped Britain. And at least until things fell apart, starting, let's say, around a decade ago, we would have to go into the details of modern French history and politics for that. But well into the 21st century, this remained the case. So I think you're right, Stephen.
Great. Peter, then we have Advent, and we'll have to probably round it out at that point. So Peter first.
Thank you, Matthew. And good afternoon again, Martin. I had a brief question that I thought of while you were talking, and you touched on the first question I had briefly when you addressed de Gaulle's history in Poland in 1920. And I'd like to know Charles de Gaulle's influence upon Tukhachevsky in the combined arms doctrine that he developed and was not able to finish on account of his untimely death in 1935. And the follow-up I thought of is, how did the Suez Crisis precipitate Charles de Gaulle's return in 1958?
Two huge questions, both enormously worthwhile and worth asking. And I'll blame you for me talking at length. Matt, you'll have to rein me in on both of these. Let's start with the... First of all, on both of them, you're right on the money. Let's start with the second. The Suez fiasco of 56-57 is another mortal blow to the Fourth Republic, which has been dying since it was born anyway. It isn't the final finishing stroke. The final finishing stroke is the threat of a fascist takeover backed by the CIA, and certainly backed by Eisenhower in 1957-58. Nobody has ever brought Eisenhower into this, but there can be no doubt that Eisenhower would have vastly preferred a pro-American French dictatorship to democratic France. But at the same time, he didn't want de Gaulle. De Gaulle was too big for Eisenhower. They had both worked together and de Gaulle understood Eisenhower's genuine weakness in indecision and bungling and genius for covering up his own enormous mistakes far too well. But also, de Gaulle knew something else about Eisenhower. He knew that Eisenhower was in favor of political assassination. It goes back to 1942 when Eisenhower cuts a deal with Admiral Darlan, the head of the French Navy, who is also an outright fascist and anti-Semite, and really a nasty man, but a very able man, and very anti-British. And the British loathe this deal, and American public opinion loathes the deal, and Eisenhower has really screwed up. Or has he? Because the deal saves thousands of American lives. If Eisenhower had not made the deal, Operation Torch might well have failed. As it was, American forces are so green that 1,000 British soldiers are killed by the French, not by the Germans. There are no Germans in North Africa yet. None. In West North Africa. None. And yet the Vichy French alone kill 1,000 American soldiers in the first days of the takeover until Darlan tells them to lay down arms. Now, had Montgomery not won the Battle of Alamein, or had Montgomery not been brought in, and had Churchill's choice General Gott been allowed to command the Eighth Army, Rommel would have annihilated the Eighth Army, swept east, and the American army would have been annihilated by Vichy France, calling in the Germans for support, and 50 to 100,000 American boys would have lost their lives. So Montgomery at Alamein saves the lives of scores of thousands of Americans, and has never once in American historiography since then, or British either, but especially American, been given any credit for this whatsoever, and it is crucial. Now back to 1956-57. Britain is humiliated. It's got a traumatic effect on the British ruling class. It has an equally traumatic, humiliating effect on the French ruling class. They fuck up everything. First, they fucked up Algeria and lost it. Then they fucked up, first they fucked up Indochina and lost it, and Vietnam. Then they fuck up Algeria and lost it. Now, even with the United States, and with Britain on their side, the old enemy, they provoke America of all people, mighty America, to rein them in from Suez, and they look like a fiasco. And this is just another nail in their coffin in Algeria. Can they do nothing right? The answer is obvious. They actually have very impressive domestic policies. But as far as the world sees, as far as the French public sees, they can do nothing right. And in foreign policy and national security, they can't do anything right. So you're right. This is a crucial nail in the coffin. And it is central to helping De Gaulle come in 1958-59. And let us notice, where the Fourth Republic charges in with Israel in 1956, and then gets egg on its face when America forces it to pull out, De Gaulle is much more cautious. De Gaulle still sells Israel the military superiority tanks, and most of all, the incomparable Mirage 3 jets, which are the best air combat and air-to-ground support combat aircraft in the world at the time in the 1950s and 60s. Far better than anything has come up, anything America has come up with in that time. Something else you never see in any American military historiography there. The Mirage is better than anything America has produced. And it was built under the Fourth Republic. But De Gaulle and the Fifth Republic still happily supply to Israel. But once Israel knocks out every Arab army and looks like it's going to stay in those lands after 67, 68, De Gaulle changes. De Gaulle enrages American Jews and American conventional opinion by being prophetic. He says Israel is out of control. These people have no tradition of statecraft. They have no tradition of empire. They have no tradition, therefore, of restraint. They have no tradition of balance. It will go to their heads like it went to the heads of the Germans. They are an arrogant, headstrong, immature people. I remember as a teenager reading those words, and it was like, every Jewish friend I knew felt it was a slap in the face to them, right? And I can understand that. But you look back now from a perspective of 60 years, and what Netanyahu and his out-of-control lunatics are doing, it's a completely different Israel, which was certainly a tough and ruthless Israel, but also a rational and controlled Israel with a sense of its own tiny size in the 50s and 60s, as opposed to this maniac idea of declaring war on Iran. De Gaulle, again, is ahead of his time. He is coming from a tradition, as the British were, much as you may loathe them, as the Americans ought to be today, except we haven't learned, as the Russians learned fitfully over the years as well. When you've had major empires and you've had to give them up, or maybe even recovered from giving them up afterwards, It can give you, it should give you a sense of realism and restraint about the yin and yang, the coming and going, the ups and downs of countries and empires, as well as of individuals. You learn to ride things out. You learn to take a longer view. De Gaulle realized in the 1960s these British were not taking that long-term view, and that it could be very dangerous to them as well as everybody around them if they were not reined in. And wasn't he right? Wasn't he right? Now, as to your other question, remind me of it again. I've been going on so much about Suez.
Discuss Charles de Gaulle's influence upon Marshal Tukhachevsky and his combined arms.
The answer is profound, enormous. There's no question Tukhachevsky read de Gaulle's books. There's no question he tried to apply them on a massive scale. The two men were friends. They had been prisoners of war together in World War I. The fact that Stalin murdered Tukhachevsky was very much noted by the young de Gaulle. I think Lacouture has some very interesting sections in his great biography of de Gaulle about this. De Gaulle was always skeptical about the Russians. There is a fascinating story told. He develops excellent relations with the Russians. Again, an example for us for world peace today in the 21st century. But on one occasion under Brezhnev, he's flown to Stalin, all the way to Stalingrad, to see the site of the great victory over the Nazis. And as they land at Stalingrad, de Gaulle pronounces to the staff and the French journalists around him, "What a magnificent people. What an extraordinary achievement." And one of them says to him, "Ah, yes, that they defeated the invincible Nazi Wehrmacht." And he says, "No, I'm talking about the Germans for getting this far in the first place." So he has a very nuanced and dry, and in many respects cynical attitudes towards the Russians. Oh, one quick point, Mike Blythe, I haven't had a chance to put it in the chat. You ask a very interesting and relevant question. Could de Gaulle have been eliminated in 1969? Well, especially in this seminar, I have learned, I think more than anyone, I always dismissed such theories. Now I know much better than to dismiss them completely. But I think that is unlikely because they had already eliminated him politically. He was old. He was very much slowing down. He was not trying to have any direct influence in life anymore. The one significant foreign trip he made after he resigned as president was right afterwards to Ireland, of all places, to spend a couple of weeks recuperating from having resigned the presidency with his close friend, even older than he was, Irish President Eamon de Valera, another nationalist who had lived through the previous 60 years of the century, another old, brave patriot and combat warrior, another brilliant political leader, someone else who loathed Britain, someone else who loathed out-of-control liberalism, someone else who was a devout Catholic, along with Malraux, about the only other oldest friend who still survived to the end with de Gaulle was Eamon de Valera. But then he goes back home to Colombey des Églises, and he basically plays cards with his wife for the rest of his life while working on some more memoirs until he dies. So no, murderous, vengeful bastards though they were, I don't think they did go out of their way to kill him. All the indications I've seen of his death was entirely natural, and he was not. President Roosevelt, for example, Matt and I have talked about this, but I think I'd love to have feedback from other people here. I have still not seen any hard evidence anywhere that FDR was eliminated by the British in 1945. None. But the suggestive evidence that they had the means and most of all the motivation and drive to do it, and that Churchill would have been reckless and vicious enough to do it and vengeful enough, and imagining it was crucial for the survival of the British Empire. Those things are all true. So I would suggest anyone who can look into any evidence, not the soft background evidence, because the means and motivation are all there. I mean, he died on Bernard Barrack's estate. Barrack had been an intimate friend of Churchill's for 30 years. Churchill had made Barrack a billionaire in World War I by the arms contracts he gave him as Minister of Munitions in the Lloyd George government. All of these things apply. Nor did FDR expect to die, but FDR looked very frail. Everybody around him thought he was on borrowed time. There's no question he nearly died right after coming back in October 1943 from Tehran from the stress of the flights. And that the great American Jewish doctor, Dr. Howard Gruen, one of the great unrecognized American heroes of World War II, kept President Roosevelt alive almost single-handedly for 18 months with his heart treatments for him. That is, I can document very deeply for you. But did the British have motivation in 1945? Yes, they very much did. And notice Churchill's extraordinary behavior. He refuses to go to the funeral. He refuses to go to the funeral. Why? Well, he hated FDR, and wasn't it crucial for him to develop a relationship with Truman, who he had never met? Doesn't do that. So there are questions, and Churchill is reckless enough to withhold the crucial evidence, as I've said before, that would have alerted FDR and the US government into the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, not just in principle, but the British, through a breaking of the JMS code and radio monitoring, knew the exact time, the exact day, the exact location, the exact place, the exact route the Japanese six-carrier strike force was taking from the north. This was British naval intelligence, Royal Navy intelligence in Singapore decrypted this. They sent it to London. 50 years later, the officer in charge of this decryption, an honorable man, an Australian officer, writes a book of memoirs. Betrayal at Pearl Harbor, it is called. Write it down, look it up, buy it for yourselves. Don't take my name for it. Betrayal at Pearl Harbor by Eric Nave, N-A-V-E. But Churchill sat on that intelligence and refused to pass it on to FDR. But do we have a smoking gun? No, we don't. And was FDR clearly a dying man? Yes, he was a dying man, and everyone in his family, everyone in the Secret Service, all his political intimates, all of them knew it, except for Henry Wallace, of course, who was a twit. Truman was shrewd enough to see it, and Truman didn't want to be president. He loved the Senate, and he was even reasonably happy as vice president. But like Thomas Marshall in 1919, he was terrified of becoming president, especially after FDR. So at the conscious level, he certainly didn't want it. But it's worth looking into. Can anyone come up with a smoking gun that the British eliminated FDR in April 1945? I have no evidence for it whatsoever, none, but it is not conceptually inconceivable.
Like you and I have said, the motive was there.
Yes,
but smoking guns, no, not so much. But then again, there was never, like we said, never an autopsy.
Exactly.
So without an autopsy, you're not really going to know. So unless they exhume the body, which I know Stalin wanted, and I don't know. I think Elliot Roosevelt also wanted to exhume the body, but
to me, I did not know that. But that to me is most interesting. And of course, Stalin's paranoia should not be, like you say, it should not be ignored. He was a paranoid bastard, but he also had the best intelligence service in the world at that time, like the French were in 1963. By the way, something else the SDEC informed De Gaulle very reliably on. De Gaulle's two comments when he attended President Kennedy's funeral, both of them prophetic. First of all, he said, he looked at Johnson. He'd never met Johnson before. And he said, now at last the true nature of America is revealed. The veneer of, he drew a parallel with the three slavery presidents from the South, George, who succeeded Washington, which of course Washington had slaves too, but freed them. He drew a parallel with Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. And then after John Adams comes Andrew Jackson. And he said, he saw Lyndon Johnson as an Andrew Jackson figure. He said, the veneer of civilized behavior is removed and the true face of the great republic is revealed. In Johnson's boorishness, even before he jumped into Vietnam, the restraint was gone. The good manners were gone. The breeding was gone. There are parallels with President Trump's reactions now, unfortunately, under pressure as he's been pulled into this Iran catastrophe. But that's a very interesting perspective from de Gaulle. An 18th century cultivated, civilized French-European perspective on the uncouth Americans, but it doesn't come from the Brits. And the other comment he made, I think it was Malraux, says to him, wasn't Jacqueline Kennedy's poise, her dignity, her restraint, her behavior, so admirable. Didn't it put all the crowned heads of Europe to shame with her dignity? De Gaulle shrugged it off. He said, means nothing. She will find herself a wealthy Greek ship owner, and that will be the end of the matter. Now, of course, he wasn't just being a prophetic genius. He already knew. Of course, French intelligence knew that Jackie was already sleeping with Aristotle Onassis. As I've said before, there's this end, but it's a great brief story, briefly worth repeating. French and British intellectuals, Russian and English intellectuals have been fiercely, energetically divided for 80 years over the great pressing issue of the age. Did my teacher Isaiah Berlin sleep with Anna Akhmatova when he visited her in Leningrad in 1946? All the British, every Oxford intellectual and scholar who taught me, every one of principle who has talked on this matter, every figure of British distinction, says, no, you had to know Sir Isaiah. He was a gentleman. He was shy with the ladies. He revered Akhmatova. Such activities would never have occurred to him. And every Russian says, no, you had to know Akhmatova. She was in her 40s, but she was still dynamic. She was beautiful. She was irresistible. And she was Russian. And she always took what she wanted and needed. Of course, she made sure he slept with her. And of course, he did. Well, this had been, how do you reconcile or solve such an incredible problem? I believe I can, and I have. It's very simple. The answer is incredibly simple. And remember, I knew Sir Isaiah. I sat at his feet. He was my mentor. I worked for him for 3 years at the British Academy of Arts and Sciences and had to deliver personal reports and the kind of research and archival work I was doing for him. He was a lovely man. Yes, of course, they slept together. Why do I say that? Because what did the Russians know that the British did not? They knew not only that the secret police, the NKVD, had Akhmatova's rooms bugged for sound. They knew what went on there, and they had close surveillance. Of course, they knew if they slept together, if they didn't. That's why they were so certain. The British had theory, the Russians had fact, and common sense. Simple. I don't care how many fucking theoretical arguments or how many theological angels dance on the end of how many theoretical pins, or what a great philosopher he was and what a great poetess she was. Sure they were. But the Russians looked with their own eyes. They saw what was going on.
Vince, I believe that's Jean-Sébastien. You still there?
No, c'est moi.
Oh, hello,
Oh,
Petey.
excellent.
Right.
Marty, that was great as always. I wanted to ask you about Marine Le Pen and how she fits into it all. What do you think of her and thoughts?
I think she's a Gaullist without the name.
Really?
Yes. I mean, she goes to much more extremes than de Gaulle. She is, in a way, you could say, Trump is to Reagan, as in a way, politically and symbolically, as Le Pen is to de Gaulle. I think de Gaulle's true successor has yet to emerge, and it is not Madame Le Pen. De Gaulle's true successor has to be deeply Christian, has to be conservative while open to people who are not conservative, has to be ruthless at first, but then inclusive afterwards. In a way, de Gaulle's successor also has to be a French Ataturk. They will be facing an even more divided France, an even more threatened France than Le Grand Charles himself did. And let me add here, I am convinced we will see this leader. He or she will emerge in France. I personally do not yet think it will be Madame Le Pen, but I do not rule her out either. I have a great respect and admiration for her, especially her steadfastness, her courage. She has taken positions which outrage people on both sides of the Senate. She has taken difficult positions. She stands up against the Islamist threat and against the uncontrolled immigration threat, which outrages everybody on the liberal left. And yet at the same time, she also opposes anti-Semitism. Now, the state of Israel needs to be reined in, as De Gaulle himself, for all the rest of his life, after 1967, the remaining 3 years of his life, repeatedly warned. But anti-Semitism is a monstrous and dangerous evil that always, not only is it poisonous and contemptible in itself, and I feel the same way about general anti-Muslim prejudice. I think they're both hideous traps. Something again that comes back to a philosophy you taught me, Matt, the warning of against false dichotomies. That if there's a clear monstrous evil that is communism, you do not suspend all your humane and real and decent human and classical and spiritual values and throw them overboard to join Nazism because that will stop communism. No, they're two sides of the same coin. Or the false dichotomies which are political parties in a supposedly milder way of putting on the West. I think Madame Le Pen really stands against those two dichotomies. I am a great admirer of her. If I could work for her, if you could recommend her to me, I could use the money, and hopefully she could find a use for me. And I am not joking. Please help me network with her people. But I am a great. I'm in the De Gaulle tradition and proud of it. In the 1980s, the Washington Times sent me to France, and Arnaud de Bourgrat, who knew everyone, introduced me to a man who died tragically 36 years ago, and a great figure again in the humane and moral survival of the West. And that was the French political philosopher Jean-Marie Benoit. And Jean-Marie was very much in the De Gaulle tradition. But he was also in what are still central parts of the French Catholic Christian and spiritual traditions, which Matt and Cynthia, and most people in this, if not everyone in this group, are part of as well, because he believed also in spiritual values that are both positive and negative, that are totally unfashionable in the Western world. On one occasion, we are walking towards the entrance of the Louvre, past it. And being Jean-Marie, of course, where are we going? We're going to one of his favorite restaurants, which is where he loves to do business, especially with American American friends, with a reasonably generous, entertainment allowance, which the Washington Times in its wisdom gave me at that time. And we passed the entrance to the Louvre. We passed what President Mitterrand has proudly recently opened, and the whole world has known since, the glass pyramid in the courtyard of the Louvre. And what does one of the most eminent political philosophers in France, who was also a senior political strategist and advisor to the future president of France, Jacques Chirac, and who was at the time still mayor of Paris and who had previously been prime minister, what does this eminent political and philosophical figure say? He points it to me and says, Martin, this is proof of the power of Satan. And he means it literally. This was deliberately built by the forces of the revolution to desacralize the sacred soil of the Louvre, of the palace, and of a sacred center of the sacred geometry of Paris. And he meant it. He was serious. I take such things more seriously now. In those days, I did not, but I was intelligent enough and sensible enough, at least. I mean, spending 5 or 6 years back.
Hey, Marty, could you put in your left earbud? That's where your microphone is. So your decibel level drops off by like 80% when it's off.
Okay, where did I drop off at?
Oh no, we could hear everything you said. It was just that the decibel level was unnecessary.
Oh, fine. Yeah, because that, in fact, I would try for emphasis on, because it was going back to the world of, every kind of conspiracy theory you can imagine. The Templars are still there, and the anti-Templars are still there, and the clericalists are still there, and the anti-clericalists are still there. This is something you expect to read in a bad American novel. You do not expect to hear it from. Hang on, my other bud came out. Can you hear me now? As the saying goes, this is what you expect to read in even a competently done Brad Seltzer novel, but a popular novel that's deliberately written by a fine writer, but who is deliberately melodramatic. This is what you expect to read in the potboiler. You do not expect to hear it from the lips of the main advisor on nuclear strategy and on the deterrent nature of the force de frappe, the nuclear strike force, to the prime minister or future president of France. But this is France. And this is the France that Madame Le Pen is in and is functioning in. So I do believe that the Macron policies, the Soros policies, the one world policies, the Euro policies, eagerly followed by the bankers in Paris and the people whose strings they pull, are anathema, not just to the vast mass of the French people, but to large elements of the French elite as well. And I do believe that the spirit of Le Grand Charles, President de Gaulle, is still alive and flourishing and seething beneath the surface, and that it will eventually emerge, but just as it did in 1940 in France's moment of greatest shame and greatest humiliation and greatest disaster. And one last point, if I may here, and this is a fitting point to say at the end or close to the end, and that is we are talking about a man who, I will argue vigorously, is a far greater and better figure for the French people and in French history and culture and civilization and for the soul of France than Louis XIV himself or even than Le Grand Napoleon. Napoleon tries to conquer Europe and destroys a generation of the French people. The most populous nation in Europe, more popular than Russia, is drained of its manpower in ways that still haunt it at 225 years later, since Napoleon became emperor. So this 200 years later, to this day, because of the wars of aggression and empty glory that Napoleon fought. And he took over a powerful France. But de Gaulle did not try to conquer Europe with fire and sword. He liberated Europe. He liberated it first militarily with his extraordinary achievements in World War II, and then he liberated it spiritually and emotionally and politically and strategically with the way he saw Europe needed to go. And finally, when we look at the out of control, inept monstrosity that the European Union has become, it has become, everyone should think Charles de Gaulle taught against, and he taught us also what the antidotes to internationalism and one worldism and EUism and Brusselsism are. He taught us the example of France as a great and proud nation state and made a family of other great proud nation states like Spain, Italy, Germany, perhaps a confederation of Central Europe again, to rebuild European culture and civilization and values as he lived them and embodied them.
I'm going to give the very, very last question to Jerry and Madeline.
Yipes, there is more.
All right.
By all means.
They snuck in there and they have a trump card that they can wield, so they can
always have trump cards. Yes. As dearest of friends. And the greatest
Hello, Mike. Well,
Jerry, it's bound to be a fastball. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, Martin, when you talk about de Gaulle, and you have a bunch of us Canadians listening, I mean, yes, all we're thinking about is his trip to Quebec in 1967. And some of these younger guys don't know, but I was alive then. I was a young guy of 13, and I didn't know politics from nothing. I knew nothing about nothing. I couldn't even spell politics. But after de Gaulle came, it like woke me up, and I think it woke up the entire country. You either loved him or you hated him. That's the effect he had. But so I know what happened in Canada, but I was wondering if you could tell us, because I don't know, what was the reaction in London, in England, to de Gaulle's speech in Quebec? If you have any comments on that, I would love to hear it.
For once, I mean, you and Stephen and Magdalena always ask me, Richard, you let me off light today, questions that I could at least answer in less than 3 hours. And again, this is actually a quick answer, but it's an important question. The answer is fascinating. Contempt, rage, hatred. Simple as that. How dare he? Canada is English and that's it. What? There are a handful of malcontents who dare to speak the frog lingo in Quebec? How dare they? What are they doing there? Send them back to Normandy. That'll teach them. That's the British attitude. Nothing more, nothing less. But I mean, I throw it back to you, my perspective over the years. And the irony was, I traveled extensively in Quebec and in Ontario and eastern parts of your great country way back in 1974. And I haven't been back except to fly through airports since then. I would love to, the older I get, the less likely it becomes, but I would love to get back, see some of you wonderful folks in person rather than just via Zoom. But the sense I have, and any of you correct me on this, is that he actually did Canada and Canadian society a service. The Canada that developed and evolved, that the first Trudeau, with all his manifold faults and repulsive,ness and idiocy and contemptible nature, was nevertheless forced to acknowledge, and that all, even triumphalist, America-loving Anglophone prime ministers since have been forced to acknowledge, is a stronger, better, more diverse Canada, in which not only does Quebec play a larger role in the culture, in the politics, in the economy, in the industry, but in the philosophy and the nature of life. And this has had incomparably positive effects, not least through the proliferation of French cuisine through the rest of the country, which far too much, it was simply piss ignorant of it before. Now, I mean, that's a wild oversimplification, and I've not been back properly in such a long time. But please come back to me on that. But again, De Gaulle is ahead of his time.
I think, well, Matt has written a lot on De Gaulle's trip.
No, it was Renal Rouleau who did that work.
Ah, okay.
That's very long.
But it's
questions and answers.
I've always felt that there was a sleeping nationalism in Canada at the time, a positive one.
Yes.
That De Gaulle, I'm sure he knew it, woke up. And yeah, it shook the country right to its roots because it was a threat to the British Empire control of Canada. And I think the British had to quickly create a phony sense of nationalism to counteract De Gaulle's positive sense that he was trying to give Canadians. I mean, the year after De Gaulle's trip, you had Lévesque and the Parti Québécois sort of as a phony nationalism to counteract the positive one around Daniel Johnson and his followers. And I'm sure it had an effect on De Gaulle losing his job shortly after that, because it may not have been the reason, but I'm sure it was one of the reasons the British didn't want him around anymore. But in a way, De Gaulle really did wake Canada up, and it's not the same as what he wanted it, but no, it really had an effect on the country.
One point I'd like to add to that, but I think you've nailed it again, is I come across again and again, you have people like Churchill, and everything they touch turns out to be a catastrophe, a fiasco. Everything. They don't mean it even to be that way, but there is a natural, not just repulsiveness, but a natural ineptitude to them. But De Gaulle is the opposite. Everything he touches outrages the conventional liberal imperialistic Anglophone, Anglo-Saxon wisdom of the time, drives them to Eamon de Valera, who did certainly have very significant negative aspects to him, had this to some degree. You can't understand President Trump without recognizing that you cannot praise Trump without losing close friends and family members attacking you, and I have. You cannot attack him without losing close friends and family members. Is anything you say about the old guy, and this is not just now, it's been true ever since he came in, he cannot help being a lightning rod for good or ill. President de Gaulle is a much more benign figure, but again, in a Cassandra Greek ironic way, which he would have, with his wry humor, I think well have appreciated and recognized. And that is, the more outrageous he sounds at the time, the wiser he becomes with retrospect. And it's like he's an Archimedes lever going through time. The further away you get from him, the higher and greater he becomes. And I do not believe he is close to the height of his influence and the admiration and respect and to recognition of the significance of him. I think that again, Mrs. Le Pen may be his successor, but if she is not, she is a precursor to his successor. And that when his successor comes, he will be seen in the vast stretch of French history, going back to Charlemagne himself, the first Charles the Great, as a John the Baptist figure, with the transcendent figure to reconcile all the ironies and apparent contradictions and real contradictions of French civilization and history through the millennia, not just the centuries. This is yet to come. But the last irony is he reaches this point not by being one of these fake pseudo-philosophers and says, who says, well, George Soros is right because, Diogenes said this in his barrel 2,500 years ago, or Cicero said that. On the contrary, de Gaulle reaches the heights of a Plato, the heights of a great philosophical figure, by coming up through the particular. But he rises to these grand general levels of insight and leadership, and most of all, example. Much of what Gaulle's greatness, as I said before, de Gaulle will say in a phrase which Churchill failed to say in 6 or 12 volumes. And therefore, we should go back to these pithy sayings. You just come up with another one. Vive le Québec. Vive le Québec libre. We are in an age where, again, as Matt has repeatedly warned, and Cynthia too, this effort to corral the entire West into a single conglomerate, into confrontational war with the one evil conglomerate to the East, Russia, China, Iran, they're all one. Let's just have a polarized war and exterminate the bad guys, and then we'll live happily ever after. I know so many Oxford graduates. I know so many people of supposedly serious positions in the world, heads of think tanks, presidents of universities, most eminent of the eminent, who swallow this evil, suicidal, simplistic shit. And yet what does Gaulle give us? De Gaulle says there is safety and survival and happiness and sanity in the small banding together in mutual peace and cooperation. Vive le Québec libre. Also, vive l'Irlandais libre. I find in my old age, after being raised to be a good Ulster Unionist by my mother's side of my family when I was a little boy, today I am too radical an Irish Republican for Sinn Féin and for the Irish Republican movement. I'm not violent. But what have they become? They've become Soros one world free traders as well. And I say, no, you must prepare for a world where Ireland needs to be more self-sufficient. I'm not advocating hatred of Britain, God forbid, or hatred of the North. I want a peaceful federal Ireland, a tolerant Ireland, which is the Ireland that fell apart when I was growing up even, and has been coming together since. But I want an Ireland of peace and goodwill, certainly with Scotland, but also with England. But we all need an Ireland that, like Quebec, can survive by itself, that recognizes its own roots, that will not be drawn into some mad global confrontational war that can destroy everybody.
Edie just said, Vive la France again. So now, just as de Gaulle came in to try to liberate Quebec, we need somebody to liberate France.
Amen. Yes.
Yeah. Marty, you're
Vive la France libre.
Vive la France libre. Yeah. Si, oui. And we'll try to get somehow this class over to Marine Le Pen, and maybe you can score a gig. Who knows? This is a pretty good business card.
Please do try.
Maybe Helen Peru would have an idea or two. All right, Marty, this is cool. And your poetry is always a pleasure. That's how I see your classes, is poetry. And for those who are game for more big ideas next Sunday, I just want to tell people we're going to have Phil Collins, not the singer, the philosopher, come on with a class on the mages of mutability. So that should be interesting. So next Sunday, 2 p.m. And before that, we'll do Pluralia, maybe with Alex Craner and a couple of other speakers, maybe Marty. That'll be also the anniversary of the death of FDR, actually, April 12th. Interesting. We've got to fold that into the Pluralia somehow. All right, Marty, thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. Till next one.
Matt, thank you. Folks, always a joy. Thank you.